Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you're already in bed, wrapped up in something warm, or just settling into that one corner of the couch that fits you perfectly, I'm glad you found your way here, because tonight we're going somewhere I've been wanting to take you for a long time. Somewhere beautiful on the surface, somewhere that looks, from a distance, like candlelight and silk and long gloves and Jane Austen novels. The kind of romance that makes you want to close your eyes and just live inside it for a while. But underneath all of that beauty, underneath the gowns and the ballrooms and the soft glow of Regency England, there was something else. Something that most women of that era carried with them every single day. A fear, so deeply woven into their world that it shaped every decision they made, every mirror they looked into, every birthday that came and went with a quieter kind of dread than the year before. They were afraid of getting old, not old in the way we might mean it today, not 70, not 80, not the distant, abstract someday of retirement and grey hair, old at 27, old at 30, old in a world where your entire value, your financial security, your social standing, your right to exist in polite company with dignity, was attached to something you could not hold on to, no matter how hard you tried. Your youth. And when it went, and it always went, what was left behind was not just wrinkles or tired eyes. What was left behind was a kind of invisibility, one that could swallow a woman whole. Tonight, we're going to step inside that world. We're going to feel what it felt like to watch the clock tick in a society that had decided, long before you were born, exactly when your time was up. And I think, by the end of it, you'll never read a Jane Austen novel quite the same way again. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling makes your evenings a little softer, a little richer, a little more like the kind of history you actually want to fall asleep to, it would mean the world to me if you hit subscribe and gave this a like. And I'd genuinely love to know, where are you right now? Is it late where you are? Are you already in bed with the lights off? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And knowing that someone is listening along with me in the quiet of the night, that's honestly one of my favourite things about doing this. Okay, dim those lights if you can. Let everything else go soft around the edges, and let's step back together, all the way back to a drawing room in London. The year is 1812, and a young woman is staring at her reflection in a mirror. And what she sees looking back at her is not what you might expect. She's 23 years old. By our standards, barely an adult. By the standards of Regency England, she's running out of time. Not metaphorically, not in the loose, anxious way we sometimes talk about biological clocks or career timelines. She's running out of time in the most concrete, most measurable, most publicly visible way a person can. Because in the world she lives in, the world of drawing rooms and dance cards and morning calls and the London season, a woman's worth is calculated with the precision of an auctioneer's ledger. And the single most important variable in that calculation, her age. Let me explain. Because the numbers here are genuinely startling when you lay them out plainly. A girl in Regency England typically made her debut, her official entrance into the marriage market, at the age of 17 or 18. This wasn't a casual social occasion. This was a launch. The family had been preparing for it in some cases for years. The gowns had been ordered, the introductions had been arranged, the chaperone had been carefully selected. Everything about this moment was designed to present the girl at the absolute peak of her perceived value. Young, fresh, untouched by the wear of the world. A blank page onto which a suitable husband could project whatever future he pleased. The first season was everything. If a girl was beautiful, well-connected, and had a good enough dowry, she might receive a proposal within weeks. The most desirable matches were often settled before the season was even half over. The primary stage for all of this was Almac's assembly rooms. Getting a voucher to Almack's wasn't just an invitation to dance, it was a certificate of eligibility. And the lady patronesses who controlled those vouchers, women like Lady Jersey, Lady Cowper, and the formidable Countess Leven, they understood perfectly well what they were managing. It wasn't a social calendar, it was a marketplace. And in that marketplace, youth was the most valuable currency a woman possessed. Now, a girl who didn't receive a proposal during her first season wasn't ruined. Not yet. She came back for a second season, maybe a third. But here's the thing. With each passing year, something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but perceptibly, in the way that everyone around her noticed, even if no one said it directly to her face. The whispers were gentle at first. "She's still out," they would say, using the language of the debut as though she were a product that had been placed on a shelf and simply not yet been purchased. By the third season, those whispers sharpened. By the fourth, they became something closer to a verdict. And by 25, in a world where 17 was the starting line, a woman who hadn't secured a match was increasingly regarded as something between a disappointment and a cautionary tale. 25. I want you to hold that number in your mind, because in Regency England, 25 was not young. 25 was the edge of a cliff. The historian Amanda Vickery, whose research into the private lives of Georgian and Regency women is some of the most detailed and most human work ever done on this period, documented the anxiety surrounding this age with remarkable clarity. She found letters from mothers to daughters, from sisters to sisters, from friends to friends, all circling the same quiet terror. Time was passing. The offers were not coming, and every year without a ring was a year in which a young woman's options narrowed, her bargaining position weakened, and the future she'd been raised to expect grew dimmer and more uncertain. Now, you might be thinking, well, surely love mattered. Surely some women married later and were perfectly happy. And yes, that's true, some did. But the system wasn't built for those women. The system was built around a very specific calculation. And it went something like this. A man of property, a gentleman with an estate, a profession, an income sufficient to maintain a household, was looking for a wife who would bear him children, manage his home, and reflect well on his standing in society. The younger the woman, the more likely she was to fulfill the first of those requirements. The more beautiful and well-mannered, the more likely she was to fulfill the third. And the wealthier her family, the more generously her dowry would supplement his income. Age worked against all three of these variables. A woman of 25 was assumed to be less fertile than a woman of 18, though, and I want to be clear about this, the Regency understanding of fertility was, to put it charitably, largely guesswork wrapped in moral judgment. A woman of 25 had also been seen. She'd been observed across multiple seasons, assessed, considered, and by the cruel logic of the marketplace passed over. The fact that she was still available was itself a kind of mark against her. Not because anything was necessarily wrong with her, but because the absence of an offer implied that others had already decided she wasn't quite worth the investment. Think about that for a moment. In a world where your primary purpose, as defined by law, by religion, by every social institution that shaped your daily life, was to marry and bear children, Being unmarried at 25 wasn't a personal choice. It was a failure. A public, visible, slowly unfolding failure that everyone around you could see and that you could do absolutely nothing to reverse. Because the one thing making you less desirable was the one thing you had no power to stop. Time. And here is where it gets genuinely dark. Because the fear wasn't abstract. It wasn't some vague social discomfort. The fear was rooted in something very concrete, very real, and very immediate. A woman who didn't marry faced a future that was, by almost any measure, catastrophic. Under the laws of the period, an unmarried woman had almost no independent legal existence. She couldn't own property if her father was alive. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't pursue most forms of employment without sacrificing what remained of her social standing. She was, in the language of the law, a feme soul, a woman alone, and that word, alone, carried a weight that is difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. If her father was wealthy, she might be maintained in comfort, living in the family home, dependent on his goodwill, and after his death, on whatever provision he'd made for her in his will. But if he'd made no provision, or if the estate was entailed, meaning it passed by law to the nearest male relative, she might find herself with nothing, literally nothing. No home, no income, no claim on the property she'd grown up in. The entail is one of those legal mechanisms that sounds dry and procedural until you realize what it actually meant for real women. It meant a father could love his daughter with every fibre of his being, and still, by the rigid machinery of English property law, leave her homeless the day he died. Jane Austen understood this better than almost anyone. Her novel Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811, opens with precisely this scenario. The Dashwood sisters, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, are displaced from their family home after their father's death because the estate is entailed to their half-brother. They go from comfort to near poverty in a matter of pages, and Austen, who had a gift for making the devastating feel ordinary, presents this not as a melodrama, but as a fact of life, because it was a fact of life. It happened to real women, in real families, with real consequences, all the time. Austen herself never married. She received at least one proposal, from a wealthy man named Harris Bigwither, in December of 1802. She accepted it in the evening, and withdrew her acceptance the following morning. The reasons aren't entirely clear. Some historians believe she simply couldn't bring herself to marry a man she didn't love, even knowing what the alternative might mean. What is clear is that Austen spent the rest of her life dependent on the financial support of her brothers. She moved between their homes. She lived on a small allowance. She wrote some of the greatest novels in the English language in rooms that were not entirely her own, on desks she didn't own, in houses where she was, however lovingly, a guest. She died at 41, and the fear that runs through her novels, the quiet, persistent, almost atmospheric anxiety about money and marriage and what happens to women who fall through the cracks, is not fictional. It's autobiographical. She knew what she was writing about because she was living it. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think something important is happening beneath the surface of this story, something that is easy to miss if you're only looking at the facts. The Regency fear of aging was not vanity. That is the mistake modern readers sometimes make. They look at these women and think, oh, they were just worried about wrinkles, about losing their looks, about the superficial cruelties of a beauty-obsessed culture. And yes, there was vanity. Of course there was. But the terror went much deeper than that, because what aging really meant for a Regency woman was not the loss of beauty, it was the loss of options. Every year that passed without a marriage was a year in which the walls closed in a little further, the drawing rooms got a little quieter, the invitations arrived a little less frequently. The mothers of eligible sons looked through you a little more transparently, and the future, which had once stretched out in front of you like a ballroom floor, bright and full of possibility, began to narrow into something that looked more like a corridor, a long, quiet, increasingly empty corridor. Let me take you deeper into how the economics of this actually worked, because the numbers are illuminating in a way that generalizations can't quite capture. The dowry system, which governed the financial negotiations around every respectable marriage in this period, was essentially a pricing mechanism. A bride's family was expected to provide a sum of money, land, or other assets that would accompany her into the marriage. This was the dowry. In return, the groom's family typically agreed to a jointure, an annual income that would support the wife if her husband died. The dowry was, in effect, the price of admission to marriage, and the size of the dowry a family needed to provide was directly related to the desirability of the match they were seeking. A beautiful, well-connected girl of 17 with a spotless reputation might attract a husband of substantial means with a relatively modest dowry. Her youth was itself a form of capital, and the market priced it accordingly. But an older woman, a woman of 25, 28, or 30, needed to compensate for her diminished youth with increased financial contribution. The dowry had to be larger. The terms had to be more generous. The family had to, in effect, pay a premium for the privilege of marrying off a daughter the market considered past her prime. And if the family couldn't afford that premium, if the dowry that had been perfectly adequate for a girl of 18 was no longer sufficient for a woman of 27, then the match simply didn't happen. The mathematics were brutal and perfectly transparent. Everyone involved understood exactly what was being calculated, and no one pretended otherwise. There is a scene in Pride and Prejudice that captures this dynamic with the precision of a surgeon's blade. When Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth Bennet, he does so with a mixture of condescension and pragmatism that modern readers find almost comically tactless. But what Collins is actually doing, beneath the comedy, is performing a calculation. He's assessing Elizabeth's market value, her beauty, her family's standing, her lack of fortune, her age, and arriving at a conclusion he considers perfectly reasonable. She is a good match for him because her options are limited. She should accept him because her alternatives are worse. The fact that Elizabeth rejects him, spectacularly and memorably, is one of the great moments in English literature. But the system that made Collins's calculation possible, that made his logic sound, even if his manners were appalling. That system was real. And most women who found themselves in Elizabeth's position did not have the luxury of Elizabeth's refusal. Now, let me tell you what the season actually felt like from the inside, because I think the physical reality of it gets lost in the glamour of the period drama version. The London season ran roughly from January or February through June. During these months, the fashionable world descended on London, and the social calendar became a grinding, relentless machine of events. Balls that started at 10 in the evening and went past 2 in the morning. Dinners that required hours of preparation and lasted well into the night. Morning calls, which were, despite the name, conducted in the afternoon. Promenades in Hyde Park. Visits to the opera. The pace was exhausting even for the young, And for a woman in her second or third season, a woman who already knew what it felt like to be assessed and found wanting, the exhaustion was compounded by the awareness that the stakes were rising with every passing year. Imagine what that must have felt like, night after night, entering rooms full of people who were evaluating you, standing in receiving lines, wondering if anyone would ask you to dance, smiling through conversations with men who were politely calculating whether you were worth the investment of their time and their family's resources, watching the newest debutantes arrive, 17 and glowing, and feeling, with a certainty that no one needed to articulate, that the room's attention was shifting, that the energy was flowing toward the new arrivals, the way water flows downhill, naturally, inevitably, and without malice. The malice wasn't the point. The indifference was the point. And the indifference, for a woman who had staked everything on being noticed, was devastating. There is a passage in the diary of Harriet Granville, later Countess Granville, that captures the atmosphere of the season with a wryness that I find both funny and heartbreaking. She describes a ball at which she spent the better part of 2 hours standing against a wall, watching couples dance, nursing a glass of orgeat, and contemplating what she calls the peculiar mathematics of the evening. 30 girls, 20 gentlemen, the remaining 10 left to contemplate the wallpaper. The wallpaper, she notes, was not particularly interesting. The humour is a defence mechanism, and Harriet was a master of it. But beneath the wit, the experience she's describing is one of sustained, public, inescapable evaluation. And that evaluation had consequences. The mothers watching from the edges of the room weren't simply socialising, they were scouting, noting which girls received the most attention, which were danced with by the most eligible men, which were spoken to, and which were passed over. And the information they gathered was shared, discussed, analysed, and deployed in the quiet negotiations that preceded every formal proposal. The season was a marketplace. The balls were the shop floor, and the women, young and old, were the merchandise, examined under candlelight and priced accordingly. That is the world we are stepping into tonight. A world where a woman's age was not a private matter, it was a public negotiation. A world where turning 25 felt less like a birthday and more like a sentencing. A world where the mirror was not just a mirror, it was a clock. And the clock was always ticking. And the first place that clock made itself felt, the first place where time became visible and undeniable and impossible to hide from, was the body itself. Because in Regency England, your face was not just your face. It was your resume, your credit score, your letter of introduction, and your future, all written in a language that everyone could read and no one was polite enough to ignore. What aging actually looked like in this era, what it did to skin and teeth and hair in a world without sunscreen or dentistry, or even a reliable mirror, is a story that will change the way you think about every portrait you've ever seen from this period. And that is exactly where we're headed next. There's something I want you to do before we go any further. I want you to think about the last time you looked in a mirror. Really looked. Not the quick glance on the way out the door, not the half-second check of your hair in the bathroom. I mean the kind of looking where you actually see yourself, where you notice the things that have changed, the lines that weren't there last year, the way the skin under your eyes sits differently now than it did when you were 20. We all do it. It's one of the most private, most universal, most quietly complicated things a person can do. And then we move on. We go about our day. We live in a world with moisturizers and retinol and sunscreen and filters and lighting that forgives almost everything. We have options. We have tools. We have, if nothing else, the collective agreement of modern culture that aging is natural, and that a person's worth is not determined by the smoothness of their forehead. The women of Regency England had none of that. Not the tools, not the science, and most critically, not the agreement. In their world, a woman's face was read the way we might read a financial statement, with close attention, with judgment, and with very real consequences attached to what the numbers revealed. And the numbers in this case were written in skin. Let me tell you what skin actually looked like in this era, because I think most of us carry a completely distorted image of it, shaped by period dramas and oil paintings and the soft focus romanticism of BBC adaptations. The reality was quite different. Even a wealthy Regency woman, one with servants and leisure, and access to the best her world could offer, was fighting a battle against her own skin that she was destined to lose, and to lose early. Start with the sun. We know today that ultraviolet radiation is the single greatest contributor to premature skin aging, more than genetics, more than diet, more than any other environmental factor. Chronic sun exposure breaks down collagen and elastin, the proteins that give skin its firmness and bounce. Fine lines appear first, then deeper wrinkles, then the kind of permanent texture change that no cream or treatment can fully reverse. Now, here's the thing. In Regency England, sunscreen didn't exist. The concept of ultraviolet radiation wouldn't be understood for decades. SPF was 2 centuries away. While fashionable women did prize pale skin, carrying parasols, wearing bonnets, staying indoors during the brightest hours, the protection those measures offered was partial at best. A parasol blocks some direct sunlight. It does nothing about reflected light from the ground, from water, from the pale stone of a country house terrace. A bonnet shades the forehead and top of the cheeks. It leaves the chin, the neck, and the lower face largely exposed. And those beautiful tall Georgian windows, designed to flood rooms with natural light. They let UV radiation pour in unfiltered for hours at a time. The result was that by her late 20s, a Regency woman's skin had already begun to show damage that a modern woman of the same age, using even basic sun protection, would not experience for another decade or more. Fine lines around the eyes, a roughening of the texture along the cheekbones, the first faint spots of discoloration on the forehead and the backs of the hands. None of it was dramatic, none of it was ugly, but in a world where smooth, pale, unblemished skin was the single most important visual marker of youth, and therefore of value, even subtle changes were noticed, and once they were noticed, they were interpreted. Here's the thing that genuinely gets me about this. The interpreting wasn't private. It wasn't something people did quietly in their own heads and kept to themselves. It was social, conversational, in some circles, almost recreational. The Regency era was a world of close physical observation, morning calls, afternoon visits, evening parties where people sat in well-lit rooms and looked at each other for hours. A woman's appearance was discussed openly, assessed by her peers, commented on by her rivals, catalogued by the mothers of eligible sons with the precision of a horse breeder evaluating stock at a fair. The beauty writer Mrs. A. Walker, who published a guide called Female Beauty in 1837, just at the tail end of the Regency period, described the English preoccupation with complexion in terms that make you catch your breath. She wrote that a woman's skin was considered the single most reliable index of her age, her health, her temperament, and, here's the part that stops me, her moral character. Not just her age, her moral character. The Regency mind had made a connection between beauty and virtue that went far beyond the aesthetic. A clear complexion suggested purity, modesty, good breeding, a life lived correctly. A damaged complexion suggested, and time was the enemy. Now let me talk about teeth, because this is where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect, and that I find quietly devastating. Modern dentistry, the fillings, the crowns, the cleanings, the fluoride, the entire infrastructure of dental care that most of us take for granted, did not exist in Regency England. What existed instead was a patchwork of barber surgeons, tooth drawers, and travelling practitioners who offered extractions for a fee, and not much else. Toothbrushes existed, yes. They'd been available in England since the late 1700s, made with bone or ivory handles and bristles from boar hair or horsehair. Tooth powders were used too, some of them relatively harmless, mixtures of chalk and crushed herbs, others containing ingredients that were actively destructive, including brick dust, caustic compounds, and in some formulations acids that stripped enamel faster than decay ever could. Sugar had become increasingly available and affordable throughout the 18th century. Tea, which the English consumed in enormous quantities by the Regency period, was almost always sweetened. Desserts, confections, sweetened wines, staples of the social life that defined the upper and middle classes, and the teeth of Regency England reflected this diet with brutal honesty. By her mid-20s, a woman might have already lost 1 or 2 teeth. By 30, the losses could be more significant, and a smile that revealed missing teeth, or teeth that had gone dark with decay, was not just a cosmetic problem, it was a social catastrophe. The solution, for those who could afford it, was false teeth, and the false teeth of the Regency era are a story in themselves. The most prized dentures of this period were made from a material that is genuinely unsettling to contemplate. They were called Waterloo teeth, and they were exactly what the name suggests. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, scavengers moved across the battlefield collecting teeth from the mouths of dead soldiers. Young, healthy soldiers whose teeth were, in many cases, in better condition than those of the wealthy civilians who would eventually wear them. These teeth were cleaned, sorted, and fitted into ivory or gold bases by dental craftsmen, and sold at prices that only the affluent could afford. The practice was not considered shameful, it was considered practical. Advertisements for Waterloo teeth appeared openly in London newspapers, and the demand was significant enough that the supply from a single battlefield wasn't sufficient. Teeth continued to be harvested from the dead, from executed criminals, from the poor who sold their own teeth for money, from other battlefields across Europe for years afterward. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A wealthy Regency woman, smiling in a London drawing room, with the teeth of a dead 19-year-old soldier wired into her jaw. That image captures something essential about what this era was willing to do in the name of youth. The lengths were extraordinary, the desperation was real, and the market was perfectly happy to supply whatever was demanded, no matter how grim the source. Now let me talk about hair, because hair in the Regency period occupied a position of almost totemic importance, and its loss or deterioration was experienced as something close to physical bereavement. The ideal Regency hairstyle drew heavily from classical Greek and Roman references. Hair was worn up, in elaborate arrangements of curls and braids, sometimes threaded with ribbons or adorned with feathers or jewelled pins. The look was meant to evoke the goddesses of antiquity, timeless, elevated, beyond the reach of ordinary aging, but hair, as every woman who has ever lived knows, does not cooperate with mythology. Hair thins, hair greys, hair loses the lustre and density that make elaborate styles possible. and in the Regency era, these changes arrived earlier and more dramatically than they do for most women today. Because the factors that damage hair, poor nutrition, chronic illness, the physical toll of repeated pregnancies, and the treatments women used on their hair were all working against them simultaneously. The hair preparations of this period included pomades made from animal fat, sometimes mixed with lead or mercury compounds that were believed to darken grey hair and restore shine. They did neither, at least not permanently. And the heavy metals they contained were actively toxic. Prolonged use of lead-based hair preparations could cause hair to become brittle and fall out, which is a particularly cruel irony, because the preparations were being used precisely to prevent the appearance of aging. The cure was accelerating the very thing it was supposed to prevent. Women who could afford it turned to wigs and hairpieces. A well-made hairpiece could add volume, cover thinning areas, and maintain the illusion of youthful abundance. But they required maintenance, skill to attach convincingly, and the constant awareness that they could shift, slide, or be detected by a sharp-eyed observer. The social humiliation of being discovered wearing false hair was, by the accounts of the period, acute. It wasn't simply embarrassing. It was an exposure of the gap between appearance and reality. And in a culture that had made appearance the foundation of a woman's social existence, that gap was dangerous. And then there were the cosmetics. This is the part of the story that I find most difficult to sit with, not because it's graphic, but because it reveals something about the relationship between beauty and danger that feels almost mythological in its cruelty. The most popular cosmetic preparation for the skin throughout the 18th century and well into the Regency period was a substance called Venetian ceruse. It was a face paint, a thick white paste applied to the skin to create the smooth, pale, luminous complexion that fashion demanded. It was enormously popular, widely available, and it was made primarily from white lead. Lead is a cumulative poison. It doesn't pass through the body. It accumulates in the bones, the blood, the soft tissues, and causes damage that compounds over time. Fatigue, headaches, joint pain, cognitive impairment, with prolonged exposure, damage to the kidneys, the nervous system, the brain. But here is the detail that makes this story almost unbearable. One of the earliest visible effects of chronic lead exposure is damage to the skin. Lead-based cosmetics, applied day after day, year after year, destroyed the very thing they were designed to enhance. The skin became thin, dry, discolored. Fine lines deepened. The texture coarsened. The complexion, which the ceruse was supposed to perfect, deteriorated under the ceruse itself, and the natural response, the completely understandable, completely human response, was to apply more, to cover the damage with a thicker layer of the substance that was causing the damage, to chase the illusion of youth with a poison that was making youth disappear. Historians who have studied the use of toxic cosmetics across multiple centuries have described this cycle as one of the most poignant examples of systemic self-harm in the history of beauty culture. Women were not ignorant of the risks. By the late 18th century, medical writers had begun publishing warnings about the dangers of lead-based cosmetics. A London physician named Samuel Fothergill wrote explicitly about the connection between ceruse use and skin deterioration as early as the 1740s. The information was available. It was simply not powerful enough to overcome the social pressure that made the cosmetics feel necessary. Because the alternative to the ceruse, to the powder, to the careful construction of a youthful face, was to be seen as you actually were, and being seen as you actually were, at 30, at 35, in a world that had decided your value expired at 25, was something that many women found more terrifying than the poison. I find that sentence almost impossible to write without feeling something shift inside me. The idea that a woman could look at a substance she knew was harming her, know that it was harming her, and use it anyway, because the social consequences of not using it were worse than the physical consequences of using it. That is not vanity. That is survival mathematics. That is a person making a rational calculation inside an irrational system. And I think it deserves something more than judgment. It deserves understanding. Mercury was used too. Sublimate of mercury, applied to the skin as a treatment for blemishes, spots, and the early signs of aging. It worked, briefly, by chemically peeling the outer layer of skin, revealing the fresher layer underneath. The results were immediate and visually dramatic. The long-term effects were devastating. Mercury, like lead, is a cumulative toxin. It causes tremors, mood disturbance, cognitive decline, kidney damage, and eventually death. The phrase "mad as a hatter," which most people associate with Lewis Carroll, actually originated from the occupational mercury poisoning suffered by hatmakers who used mercuric nitrate in the felting process. That same substance was being applied directly to the faces of Regency women in the name of beauty. And arsenic. Arsenic was actually consumed, eaten in small doses, by women who believed it would lighten the complexion and produce the translucent, almost ethereal pallor that fashion demanded. Dr. Fowler's solution, an arsenic-based tonic introduced in the late 18th century, was prescribed for a range of conditions including skin complaints. Women used it cosmetically, wanting to achieve the look of porcelain fragility that the era idealized. The fact that porcelain fragility, when produced by arsenic, was simply the early stage of arsenic poisoning, the pallor of a body being slowly destroyed from the inside, was either not understood or not considered sufficient reason to stop. Here is something I keep coming back to when I think about all of this. We look at these practices today and we think, how could they? How could intelligent, educated, observant women put lead on their faces and mercury on their skin and arsenic in their tea? And the answer, I think, is simpler and sadder than we want it to be. They could because the alternative was worse. Not worse in absolute terms. No one was going to die from having wrinkles. But in the particular, specific, all-consuming social economy of Regency England, where a woman's face was her fortune and her fortune was her future, the alternative to the poison was the shelf, and the shelf, as we've already begun to see, was its own kind of death. Which brings us, I think, inevitably to the question of what actually happened to the women who ended up there. The women who didn't marry. The women who aged past the market's interest. The women who, by 27 or 30 or 35, found themselves on the other side of the system's attention, standing in the quiet space where the invitations stopped arriving, and the drawing-room conversations moved on without them. What did their lives actually look like? Not in novels, not in the sanitized, gently comic version of spinsterhood that popular culture has sometimes offered us, but in reality, in the actual daily texture of a life lived without a husband in a world that had been built, from the ground up, on the assumption that every woman would have one. That story is darker than you might expect, and more complicated, and in its own strange way, more human, and it's waiting for us right on the other side of this moment. There's a word that the Regency era used for unmarried women past a certain age, and the word itself tells you almost everything you need to know about how the culture felt about them. The word was spinster. We still use that word today. though mostly in a way that feels slightly antiquated, slightly joking, slightly detached from any real consequence. But in Regency England, spinster was not a joke. It was a legal classification. It appeared on official documents. It defined your status in the eyes of the law, the church, and every person who encountered it. The term originally referred to a woman who spun thread for a living, one of the few occupations available to unmarried women in earlier centuries. Over time, it lost its connection to actual spinning and became a label, a category, a quiet verdict delivered by a society that had decided a woman's primary purpose was marriage, and that any woman who had failed to fulfill that purpose was, in some fundamental way, incomplete, not wicked, not punished, simply less visible, less important, less entitled to the space she occupied in the world. Here is what the spinster's life actually looked like, and I want to be specific because the details matter more than the generalizations. A woman who remained unmarried in Regency England had, broadly speaking, 3 possible futures, and none of them was particularly comfortable. The first and most common was dependency. If her father was alive and willing, she remained in the family home, living on his generosity, occupying a position that was simultaneously protected and diminished. She was a daughter who had not left, a woman who had not fulfilled the trajectory that everyone, including herself, had expected her to follow. She ate at the family table, she attended family gatherings, she helped manage the household, assisted her mother, cared for younger siblings, and in exchange she received room and board, and the quiet understanding that this arrangement was, in the eyes of everyone involved, a consolation prize. When the father died, things changed dramatically, and usually for the worse. If the family property was entailed, the house and the land and the income passed to the nearest male heir, often a brother, a nephew, a cousin. The spinster daughter was now dependent not on her father's love, but on the goodwill of a relative who might or might not feel obligated to support her. The quality of that goodwill varied enormously. Some families were generous, some were dutiful, some were resentful, and some, and this is the part that makes my chest tighten when I read about it, simply did not have the resources to support an additional dependent, no matter how much they might have wanted to. The second possibility was paid work, and I use the word possibility with some hesitation, because the range of paid employment available to a gentlewoman in Regency England was so narrow that it barely qualifies as a range at all. The primary option was governess work. A governess was a woman of education and breeding who lived in another family's home and taught their children. She occupied a position that was, in social terms, almost impossibly awkward. She wasn't a servant, she was too well born for that. But she wasn't a member of the family either. She was something in between, a paid resident who ate alone in her room or in the schoolroom, excluded from family social events, addressed by the children she taught with a respect that the adults of the household didn't always share. The novelist Charlotte Brontë, writing a few decades after the Regency period, but describing conditions that had changed very little, captured the governess's position with devastating clarity in Jane Eyre. But you don't need fiction to understand the reality. The letters and diaries of real governesses from this period paint a remarkably consistent picture. Isolation, loneliness, the particular humiliation of being treated as both indispensable and invisible, needed for what you could do, but unwelcome for who you were. The pay was poor. A governess in the early 19th century might earn between £15 and £50 a year, depending on the family's wealth and the number of children she was responsible for. For context, a comfortable middle-class income in this period was roughly £300 a year, A governess's salary was at best a fraction of what she would have needed to live independently, and the work came with no pension, no security, and the ever-present awareness that she could be dismissed at any time, for any reason, and would need to find another position immediately, or face genuine destitution. The third possibility, and this is the one that the Regency era found most difficult to discuss openly, was poverty. Real, grinding, desperate poverty. Not the genteel poverty of Jane Austen's heroines, who always managed to maintain a certain dignity even in reduced circumstances. I mean the kind of poverty where a woman who had been raised in comfort, who'd been educated to play the piano and speak French and manage a household, found herself at 50 with no income, no home, no family willing or able to support her, and no realistic prospect of any of those things changing. The historian Bridget Hill, who studied the lives of unmarried women in the 18th and early 19th centuries, documented cases that are genuinely difficult to read. Women of formerly respectable families living in rented rooms above shops. Women selling their possessions piece by piece to cover rent. Women who had once attended balls and morning calls and garden parties, now dependent on the charity of their parish, receiving the same relief payments designed for the destitute poor. The distance between a Regency drawing room and a parish poor relief office was, for an unlucky woman, shorter than anyone wanted to admit. And here is the part that I find most quietly devastating about all of this. The spinster was not hated. She was not actively persecuted, not driven from the village, not shamed in the street. What happened to her was, in some ways, worse than any of those things. She was forgotten. She was the woman at the edge of the room whom no one quite knew what to do with. She was the aunt who helped with the children, the sister who stayed home, the presence at the dinner table who occupied a chair but somehow, in the social mathematics of the era, did not quite count. The language of the period reveals this erasure with painful precision. A married woman was addressed as Mrs., followed by her husband's name, not her own. Her identity was anchored, defined, made socially real by the man she had married. An unmarried woman was Miss, and Miss, past a certain age, past a certain number of seasons, past the point where anyone expected the title to change, was not a neutral form of address. It was a signal. It said, "This woman is unclaimed. This woman is available but unwanted. This woman is still, at 40, at 50, what she was at 17. A girl who has not yet become anything else." I want to pause here, because something important needs to be said. The spinster's suffering was not primarily physical. It was not hunger, usually, though hunger happened. It was not violence, usually, though vulnerability to violence was real. The suffering was existential. It was the experience of living in a world designed around a single narrative, the narrative of courtship, marriage, and motherhood, and being the person for whom that narrative hadn't worked. It was the experience of being a footnote in a story that everyone else was starring in. And that kind of suffering, the suffering of irrelevance, of not being needed, of having no role to play in the central drama of your culture, is something that doesn't leave bruises, but it does leave marks, deep ones, permanent ones. The Regency novelist Fanny Burney, who married relatively late at 41, and who understood the spinster's position from long personal experience, wrote in her private journals about what she called the peculiar mortification of being unattached in a world where attachment was everything. She described social gatherings where she felt herself to be present, but not quite visible, noticed, but not quite seen. She wrote about the careful management of her own dignity. the effort it took to appear content in a role she hadn't chosen, to smile at other women's engagements and mean it, to celebrate other women's children and not grieve for the ones she didn't have. Burney was brilliant. She was a best-selling novelist, a friend of Samuel Johnson, a woman of genuine intellectual distinction. And even she found the spinster's position difficult to bear. Imagine what it was like for women who didn't have her talent, her resources, or her remarkable capacity for self-invention. Imagine what it was like for the ordinary spinster, the one with no novel to write, no famous friends to visit, no internal world rich enough to compensate for the external world's indifference. There is one more dimension to the spinster's life that I want to sit with before we move on, because it touches on something the Regency era found almost impossible to discuss openly, and that historians have only recently begun to take seriously: the spinster's body. The popular medical wisdom of the era held that women who didn't marry and bear children were more susceptible to a range of ailments, both physical and psychological. The uterus, which Regency medicine understood only in the vaguest and most fanciful terms, was believed to require the fulfillment of its reproductive purpose in order to remain healthy. An unused uterus, in the medical imagination of the period, was a dangerous organ, prone to wandering, causing nervous disorders, producing the hysteria that the era attributed to almost every form of female distress. This was not fringe medicine. This was mainstream medical opinion, published in respected journals, taught at respectable institutions. The idea that an unmarried woman's body was somehow incomplete, somehow operating against its own design, was accepted as readily as any other medical fact of the period. And the psychological effect of this belief on the women who lived inside it is something I find almost unbearable to contemplate. Not only were you socially invisible, not only were you financially precarious, your own body, according to the best available science, was failing you because you had failed to use it for its intended purpose. The shame was total. It came from every direction, social, legal, medical, moral, and it left nowhere to hide. And yet, women survived it. They survived it with a resilience that the history books have only recently begun to acknowledge, and that I think deserves a great deal more recognition than it has received. But that resilience is a story for later in our journey tonight. For now, I want to take you in a different direction, toward the women who did marry, who did fulfill the narrative, who did everything the system asked of them, and who discovered, sometimes to their genuine surprise, that marriage was not the end of the fear. It was, in many cases, just the beginning of a different kind, because the Regency wife had her own relationship with aging, her own terrors, her own calculations, and her own version of the shelf, and marriage, for all the security it promised, did not make those terrors disappear. It simply changed their shape. Let me explain what I mean by that, because I think this is one of the most overlooked aspects of the Regency woman's experience of aging, and one of the most psychologically interesting. We've spent a lot of time tonight talking about the fear of not marrying, but there was an equally powerful and equally corrosive fear that lived inside the marriage itself. The fear of being replaced, not divorced. Divorce in Regency England was extraordinarily rare, prohibitively expensive, and socially catastrophic for the wife in almost every case. The fear wasn't of a legal separation. It was of something quieter, more insidious, and in its own way more devastating. The fear that your husband's attention, his affection, his desire, the invisible thread that connected your security to a younger woman, a more attractive woman, a woman who still had what you were losing. The Regency era didn't have a word for what we might now call the male midlife crisis, but the phenomenon was well understood, well documented in the private correspondence of the period, and well feared by wives who watched their husbands' eyes wander at balls and dinner parties. A husband who lost interest in his wife might not divorce her, but he might stop being kind to her. He might take a mistress. He might spend more time in London and less time at the family estate. He might reduce her household allowance. He might simply withdraw, emotionally and practically, into a version of married life that was technically intact, but functionally empty. The wife had almost no recourse in any of these scenarios. She couldn't compel her husband's attention. She couldn't legally prevent him from taking a mistress. She couldn't leave the marriage without losing everything: her children, her home, her social standing, her financial security. She was, in the most literal sense, trapped inside a contract that gave her security in exchange for compliance, and the compliance included, among many other things, remaining attractive enough to hold her husband's interest in a world that was constantly producing newer, younger alternatives. This is where the married woman's relationship with the mirror became its own particular form of torture, because the single woman looked in the mirror and saw her marriage prospects diminishing, but the married woman looked in the mirror and saw something arguably worse. She saw the gap between herself and the women her husband was encountering in the social world they shared: the debutantes at Almack's, the young wives of his friends, the daughters of his colleagues. Every social gathering was a stage on which her aging was performed alongside someone else's youth, and the comparison was never in her favour. The historian Amanda Foreman, whose biography of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, remains one of the most vivid accounts of aristocratic life in this period, documented the particular agony of women who watched their husbands form attachments to younger women. The Duchess herself endured her husband's long-running affair with Lady Elizabeth Foster, a woman who was eventually invited to live in the same house as the Duke and Duchess. Creating a domestic arrangement of such exquisite awkwardness that even the jaded society of the period found it remarkable. The Duchess bore it. She had no choice. She bore it with grace and wit and a public composure that concealed, according to her private letters, a depth of humiliation that she could barely articulate. And then there was the particular cruelty of aging alongside your own children. A Regency woman who married at 20 and bore her first daughter at 21 would be 38 or 39 when that daughter made her debut at 17. 38. By the standards of the era, she was firmly past her prime. Her skin showed the wear of 2 decades of inadequate sun protection and childbearing. Her figure had been reshaped by multiple pregnancies. Her teeth might already be compromised. And there, beside her at Almack's, stood her daughter, 17, luminous, possessed of exactly the youth and freshness that the mother had lost and could never recover. The psychological complexity of this moment is something I find genuinely poignant. The mother wanted her daughter to succeed. She'd spent years preparing for this debut, investing time and money and social capital in ensuring her daughter would make the best possible impression. She loved her daughter. She wanted the best for her. And at the same time, standing beside her daughter at the ball, she was standing beside the living, breathing evidence of her own obsolescence. The daughter was the replacement. The market was looking at the daughter now. The mother's role had shifted from protagonist to supporting character. And the shift was visible, public, and irreversible. Some mothers navigated this transition with extraordinary grace, some did not. The Regency letters and diaries contain both kinds of accounts. Mothers who celebrated their daughters' successes with what appears to be genuine joy, and mothers whose pride was visibly contaminated by something harder to name. Jealousy is too strong a word. Grief might be more accurate. The grief of watching the world give your daughter the attention it once gave you, and knowing the giving would never reverse. There is a passage in a letter written by a Mrs. Libby Powys, a gentlewoman who kept detailed diaries of her social life in the late 18th century, that captures this with an honesty that took my breath away when I first read it. She describes attending a ball with her grown daughter, and noticing, with a clarity she describes as almost painful, that the young men who approached her did so only as a formality, a brief courtesy on their way to her daughter. She was, she wrote, the corridor through which they passed on their way to the room they actually wanted to enter. The corridor. I find that metaphor devastating in its precision. Not a wall, not a door, a corridor, a space you move through quickly on your way somewhere else. I want to sit with that image for a moment, because I think it captures something essential about the married woman's experience of aging that the spinster's story doesn't quite reach. The spinster feared the absence of love. The married woman feared something subtler, and in some ways more painful. The presence of love that was slowly, imperceptibly, being redirected away from her, not taken violently, not stolen, simply flowing like water toward the lowest point, the newest channel, the path of least resistance. And she stood on the bank watching it go, and she could not hold it, and she could not follow it, and she could not pretend it wasn't happening. The toll this took on the Regency wife's body was compounded by the toll that marriage itself had already extracted. Beyond the physical demands of childbearing alone, there was another dimension that is often overlooked. The sheer exhaustion of running a household in an era when household management was genuinely demanding physical and mental labour. A Regency wife of the middle or upper classes was responsible for the management of a domestic operation that included, depending on the size of the household, between 3 and 30 servants. She planned menus, she managed accounts, she supervised cleaning, laundry, food preservation, and the maintenance of the house itself. She organised social events that could involve dozens of guests, elaborate meals and logistics that would challenge a modern event planner. She did all of this while pregnant, while nursing, while recovering from the last pregnancy and preparing for the next one. The energy this required was enormous, and it was drawn from the same finite reserve that was also being depleted by the emotional labour of maintaining her marriage, managing her appearance, navigating the social world, and dealing with the chronic low-level health problems that accumulating pregnancies and inadequate medical care had produced. By 40, many Regency wives were, to put it plainly, exhausted. Not the temporary exhaustion of a hard week, the cumulative, bone-deep exhaustion of 2 decades of unrelenting physical and emotional labour, performed without adequate rest, without adequate nutrition, without adequate medical support, and without any public acknowledgement that the work they were doing was, in fact, work. And it was into this exhaustion that the fear of aging settled most deeply. Because exhaustion shows on the face, it shows in the posture, it shows in the eyes. The Regency wife who was tired, who was worn, who had given her body and her energy to the production and maintenance of a household and a family, could not hide the evidence of that giving. And the evidence, in a world that read a woman's face as a ledger, told a story that the world interpreted not as sacrifice, but as decline. There is something I want to say about this carefully, because I think it matters and it tends to get lost in the more dramatic stories we've been telling tonight. The Regency wife who aged was not just losing her beauty, she was showing the cost of her usefulness. Every line on her face, every grey hair, every sign of physical wear was the receipt for a service she had rendered, a child she had borne, a household she had managed, a crisis she had navigated, a husband she had supported. The aging was not separate from the work. It was the evidence of the work, and the system that benefited from that work. The husband who ate the meal she planned, the children who wore the clothes she supervised, the house that ran smoothly because she ran it. That system looked at the evidence of her labour and called it ugly. I find that simultaneously enraging and heartbreaking, and I think the women who lived inside it found it something close to both of those things too, though they had fewer words for it and fewer places to say them. There is a passage in a private letter, written by an unnamed gentlewoman to her sister, preserved in a county archive in Wiltshire, that historians have dated to approximately 1817. The letter is not famous. It was never intended for publication. It was found among a collection of family papers donated to the archive in the 1960s, and it's been quoted only a handful of times, in footnotes, in specialized academic studies, in the kind of scholarship that's read by dozens of people rather than thousands. But the passage itself has the quality of lightning. The woman writes to her sister about a morning she spent sitting in her bedroom, unable to bring herself to go downstairs and face the day. She describes looking at her hands, the hands that had held her children and managed her house and written 1,000 letters and arranged 1,000 meals, and seeing in them a stranger's hands, old hands, rough hands, hands that didn't match the person she felt herself to be inside. She writes, "I am still here. I am still the same woman I was at 20, but the mirror says otherwise, and the mirror is what everyone believes. I am still here. I am still the same woman I was at 20, but the mirror says otherwise, and the mirror is what everyone believes." That sentence, written 200 years ago by a woman whose name we don't know, is, I think, one of the most honest things anyone has ever said about the experience of aging. It captures the central paradox, the gap between the internal experience of selfhood, which does not age the way the body does, and the external interpretation of the body, which is all the world has to work with. She knew who she was. The world only knew what it could see, and what it could see was getting older, and what it interpreted from that aging was decline, was diminishment, was the slow withdrawal of the person the world had once found valuable. I want to hold that woman in my mind for a moment, that anonymous writer in Wiltshire, sitting in her bedroom, looking at her hands, feeling the distance between who she was and who the world had decided she was, because I think she speaks for every Regency woman who aged, and for a great many women who are aging right now, tonight, in rooms not so different from hers. And then, for many of these women, came the event that transformed everything: the husband's death. The moment when the married woman's fear of aging, which had been managed however imperfectly within the structure of the marriage, suddenly lost its structure entirely. The widow, the dowager, the woman who had been someone's wife and was now, in the eyes of the world, someone's memory. The moment a married woman's husband died, she entered a world of rules and restrictions and quiet social recalibrations that was, in its own way, every bit as suffocating as the spinster's. That's where we're going next, and I promise you, the rules of that world will surprise you. Let us begin with a number, because the number is important, and it reveals something about the fragility of marriage in this era that we tend to forget when we're distracted by the romance of it all. The average life expectancy for a man in Regency England, a man of the upper or middle classes with access to reasonable nutrition and shelter, was somewhere between 50 and 60 years. This is better than the overall average for the period, which was dragged down dramatically by infant and childhood mortality. But it means that a woman who married at 20 and whose husband lived an average lifespan could expect to become a widow in her 40s or 50s, and many became widows much earlier than that. Accident, illness, injury, the occupational hazards of military service during the Napoleonic Wars, all of these claimed men in their 30s and 40s with a regularity that the historical record makes clear. Widowhood was not an unusual fate. It was a statistically common one, and the system had rules for it. Detailed, specific, and in some cases genuinely oppressive rules that governed every aspect of a widow's behaviour from the moment of her husband's death. The first and most visible of these rules was mourning dress. When a woman's husband died, she entered a period of what the Regency and Victorian eras called full mourning. The framework was remarkably consistent. For the first year, the widow wore nothing but black. Not a tasteful black dress with a colourful scarf. Not a dark outfit with a touch of jewellery for contrast. Black. Entirely. Completely. Unrelievedly black. Her dresses were black. Her gloves were black. Her bonnet was black. Even her handkerchiefs were edged in black. The fabric was expected to be dull, not shiny. Crepe, a harsh, crimped fabric with a deliberately unpleasant texture, was the material of choice for the deepest stage of mourning. It was uncomfortable to wear. It did not drape well. It was expensive to maintain and had to be replaced frequently because it deteriorated in damp weather, which in England was essentially all weather. After the first year, a widow could transition to what was called second mourning, or half mourning, during which she was permitted to introduce muted colours into her wardrobe, greys, lavenders, mauves. But even this relaxation was governed by expectation. Too quick a transition was noticed. Too bright a colour was commented on. The widow who appeared in a blue dress 6 months after her husband's funeral was not simply making a fashion choice. She was making a statement about her grief, and the drawing rooms of Regency England were perfectly prepared to judge whether that statement was adequate. Now, here is what I want you to understand about this. It's easy to look at mourning customs from a distance and see them as quaint, even touching, a society that took loss seriously, that gave grief a structure and a language. And there is truth in that. Mourning customs did provide a framework for navigating loss at a time when emotional expression was otherwise tightly regulated. But for older women, for women who were already on the far side of the marriage market, who'd already begun to feel the social contraction that came with age, mourning was something else entirely. It was a costume that made them invisible. The black dress that signalled grief also signalled unavailability, withdrawal, the end of participation in the social life that had defined their existence. A widow in full mourning was not supposed to attend balls. She was not supposed to accept invitations to dinner parties. She was not supposed to be seen in public spaces of entertainment. She was, for a period of 1 to 2 years, effectively removed from social circulation. For a young widow, 25, 30, still within the range the marriage market considered viable, this withdrawal was temporary. She could re-enter society after a suitable period. She could, if she chose, remarry. But for an older widow, a woman of 45 or 50, whose children were grown and whose beauty, by the era's merciless standards, was no longer a negotiable asset. The withdrawal of mourning could become permanent, not because the rules required it, but because the world she returned to after the mourning period had ended no longer had a place for her. This is the moment I want to linger on, because it contains something that goes beyond the specifics of Regency England, something that touches a deeper truth about how societies treat women who have outlived their assigned roles. The widow who re-entered society after mourning was no longer a wife. She was no longer, in most cases, a potential wife. She was a dowager, a word that sounds dignified and is in practice a kind of velvet exile. The dowager moved to the smaller house on the estate, the dower house, while her son and his new wife took possession of the main residence. She received her jointure, the annual income that had been negotiated as part of her marriage settlement, which might be generous or might be barely adequate, depending on the terms agreed upon decades earlier when she was young enough for her bargaining position to be strong. Let me explain jointures for a moment, because they are one of those legal mechanisms that sound dry until you realize they determined whether a woman spent her final decades in comfort or in something approaching genteel poverty. When a Regency couple married, their families negotiated a marriage settlement that included several financial provisions. The bride's family provided a dowry, a sum of money or property that went to the husband. In return, the husband's family agreed to a jointure, an annual income that would be paid to the wife if and when she was widowed. The jointure was typically calculated as a percentage of the dowry, often around 10% per year. So a woman whose family had provided a dowry of £5,000 might receive a jointure of £500 a year upon her husband's death. £500 a year. In Regency terms, this was respectable but not luxurious. It was enough to maintain a modest household, keep a small staff, dress appropriately, eat well. But it was not enough to maintain the standard of living she had enjoyed as the wife of a man with a larger income. And crucially, the jointure was fixed at marriage. It did not adjust for inflation or changing circumstances. A jointure that seemed adequate in 1800 might feel considerably less adequate by 1830, as prices rose and the cost of maintaining even a small household increased. Some widows were luckier. Some marriage settlements were more generous. Some husbands left additional provisions in their wills, but the will was entirely at the husband's discretion. Under the legal framework of coverture, a married woman had no independent right to property. Everything she brought into the marriage, including her dowry, became her husband's to manage. If he was kind, if he was prudent, if he was mindful of her future, the provisions he left could make her widowhood comfortable. If he was careless or extravagant or simply unlucky in business, the provisions might be minimal or non-existent. Here is a detail that I find both fascinating and troubling. A widow could not automatically inherit her husband's estate. Under the laws of primogeniture that governed English property, the estate passed to the eldest son, not to the wife. The son became the master of the house, the owner of the land, the head of the family, sometimes at the age of 20 or 21. While his mother, who had managed the household for decades, raised the children, supervised the staff, and maintained the social connections that held the family's reputation together, was expected to step aside gracefully and retire to a smaller role. The dowager's position in the household was a study in calibrated awkwardness. She was the former authority. She was the mother of the current authority. She was respected usually, consulted sometimes, but she was no longer in charge, and the transition from being the woman who ran the house to being the woman who lived in the smaller house across the garden was a demotion that no amount of polite language could disguise. The novelist and diarist Frances, Lady Shelley, described the experience of dowagers she had observed in terms that I find quietly devastating. They presided, she wrote, over drawing rooms that were no longer quite theirs, attended dinners at which they were guests in houses they had once commanded, and bore it all with a composure that was expected, but rarely, she suspected, entirely genuine. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had spent 20 or 30 years as the mistress of a great house, who had chosen the wallpaper, hired the cook, decided the seating arrangements at every dinner party, was now a visitor in her own former home. She knocked before entering rooms she had once walked through freely. She deferred to her daughter-in-law on matters of household management that she could have handled in her sleep. And she did all of this not because she was incompetent or unwanted, but because the system required it, because property and authority followed the male line, because a woman's power in this world was always borrowed, always contingent, always one death away from dissolution. I want to tell you about something that happened after the death of the Duke of Devonshire in 1811, because I think it illustrates the dowager's position with a specificity that generalizations can't achieve. When the Duke died, his wife, the Duchess, one of the most prominent hostesses in England, who had presided over Chatsworth, one of the grandest estates in the country, was required to vacate the house. She moved to a smaller property. The new Duke, her stepson, and his wife took possession. The transition was handled with courtesy, with respect, with all the outward forms of familial affection. But the fact remained. The woman who had been the Duchess of Devonshire, who had defined the social life of that house for a generation, was now the Dowager Duchess, a title that preserved her rank while signalling to everyone who heard it that her era was over. The Dowager prefix was, in social terms, a kind of timestamp. It said, "This woman belongs to a previous chapter. She is not current. She is not new. She is the one who came before." And in a culture that prized novelty in women the way the stock market prizes growth, being the one who came before was a position of diminishing returns. But the dowager's experience was not uniform. Some dowagers wielded enormous influence, particularly if their jointures were generous and their personalities formidable. The Dowager Lady Spencer, mother of the famous Duchess of Devonshire, Georgiana, maintained a vigorous social life and a commanding presence well into old age, corresponding with politicians, dispensing advice, and generally refusing to accept the diminished role that convention assigned to her. She was, by all accounts, a woman who had decided that the rules about how old women were supposed to behave were suggestions rather than commands, and she lived accordingly. But Lady Spencer was exceptional, and she knew it. The letters she wrote to her daughters contain moments of self-awareness that suggest she understood exactly how unusual her position was. Most women of her age and station, she observed, were expected to become quiet, to become small, to occupy less space in the world with each passing year. Retreating from the drawing-room to the parlour, from the parlour to the bedroom, from the bedroom to the memory of those who had known them, until they were, at last, simply gone. There is something in that image that I find genuinely haunting. The slow contraction, the gradual pulling inward, not a single dramatic loss, but 1,000 small surrenders, each one barely noticeable on its own, each one reducing the circumference of a woman's world by another few inches, until what remained was scarcely enough to move around in. That was the dowager's cage, not bars, not locks, just walls that drew closer year by year, until the room was very small indeed. And if the dowager's world was one of slow, genteel diminishment, the world of the women who tried to fight back, who refused to go quietly, who spent their money and their energy and sometimes their health in desperate attempts to hold back the tide of time, is another story entirely. Because the Regency era had its own beauty industry, its own promises of eternal youth, its own gallery of quacks and charlatans and sincere but misguided practitioners who offered hope in bottles and boxes and jars, and what women did with those bottles and boxes tells you everything about how deep the fear actually went. I want to take you into that world now, into the perfumeries and the apothecary shops and the private consulting rooms and the advertisements in the morning papers, because the Regency beauty industry is one of those subjects that starts out looking almost comical, with its outrageous claims and impossible promises, and then gradually reveals itself to be something much darker and much more human than comedy allows. Let's start with what was available. The newspapers of Regency London, the Morning Post, the Times, the Morning Chronicle, regularly carried advertisements for preparations that claimed to restore youth, reverse wrinkles, brighten dulled complexions, and in some cases halt the aging process entirely. The language of these advertisements is worth paying attention to, because it reveals the exact shape of the fear they were designed to exploit. Gowland's lotion was perhaps the most famous skincare product of the Regency era. It was advertised as a treatment for redness, freckles, eruptions, and all skin imperfections, and it was used by women across the social spectrum, from duchesses to merchants' wives. Jane Austen herself mentioned it in her correspondence, though whether she used it personally is a matter of some debate among Austen scholars. The lotion was marketed with the kind of genteel discretion that characterized the upper end of the Regency beauty market. It didn't promise miracles, it promised improvement. It positioned itself as a respectable preparation, recommended by physicians, suitable for a lady of quality. Modern analysis of similar formulations from the period suggests that the active ingredient in many cases was sublimate of mercury, the same poison we discussed earlier, now bottled, branded, and sold with the implicit endorsement of the medical establishment. But Gowland's was merely the respectable face of an industry that extended far beyond the boundaries of respectability. Below the polished surface of the established perfumeries and the fashionable apothecaries, there existed a thriving underground economy of beauty practitioners whose methods range from the merely useless to the actively dangerous. The quack doctor was a fixture of Regency life, and the aging woman was his most reliable customer. These practitioners operated from rented rooms in unfashionable parts of London, or travelled circuits through provincial towns, offering consultations that combined medical vocabulary with the instincts of a confidence artist. Their treatments were typically proprietary, meaning the ingredients were kept secret, which was convenient, because disclosure would have revealed either that the treatments contained nothing of value, or that they contained substances no informed person would willingly apply to their body. One category of treatment that appears repeatedly in the historical record is the chemical peel. The concept is essentially the same as the modern cosmetic procedure: the application of a caustic substance to the skin to remove the outer layer and reveal fresher skin beneath. But the substances used in the Regency era were not the carefully calibrated pharmaceutical preparations used by modern dermatologists. They were industrial chemicals, acids of varying strength, mineral solutions, compound tinctures whose effects were unpredictable and sometimes horrifying. Contemporary accounts describe women whose faces were left raw, inflamed, and in some cases permanently scarred by treatments that had been sold to them as rejuvenating. the beauty manual was another staple of the era. Books with titles like The Mirror of the Graces, published in 1811, and The Art of Beauty, published in various editions throughout the period, offered women detailed advice on how to preserve their appearance, slow the visible signs of aging, and maintain the illusion of youth as long as humanly possible. The advice ranged from the sensible: get adequate sleep, take regular exercise, avoid excessive sun exposure, to the bizarre. Wash the face in dew collected from rose petals at dawn. Sleep with raw veal laid across the forehead. Apply a paste of egg whites and alum to the skin before attending evening engagements. The Mirror of the Graces, written anonymously by a self-described lady of distinction, is particularly revealing because of the tension that runs through it. The author warns against the use of lead and mercury cosmetics. She condemns the practice of painting the face with ceruse. She provides detailed descriptions of the damage these substances cause, and then, in the very next chapter, she provides extensive advice on how to achieve the exact same pale, smooth, youthful complexion that the cosmetics were designed to produce, using methods that are marginally safer but still rooted in the same fundamental premise, that a woman's worth is written on her face, and that any face that shows its age has failed. I find that tension genuinely moving, and I think it tells us something important about the position these women occupied. They were not stupid. They were not passive victims of a beauty industry that tricked them into self-harm. They were intelligent, observant women who understood the risks and made calculated decisions within a system that offered them very few alternatives. The beauty manual did not create the fear of aging. The fear of aging created the beauty manual, and the beauty manual, for all its contradictions, was often the closest thing a Regency woman had to a friend who would sit her down and tell her the truth about what she was putting on her face. There is one particular practice from this era that I want to share with you, not because it's the most dramatic, but because I think it captures the emotional texture of the experience more honestly than any of the more sensational examples. It's the practice of the morning preparation, the daily ritual that a Regency woman of a certain age performed before she allowed herself to be seen by anyone outside her immediate household. The preparation began early, sometimes an hour or more before the rest of the household was expected to stir. The woman sat at her dressing table, and with the help of her lady's maid, if she had one, or alone, if she did not, she began the process of constructing the face she would present to the world. The skin was washed, patted dry, and examined in the unforgiving light of a candle or an oil lamp, since natural light hadn't yet filled the room. Any blemishes, spots, or discolorations were treated with whatever preparation she had available. The skin was then coated with a base layer, sometimes a light powder, sometimes something heavier, depending on how much she felt needed to be concealed. Colour was added to the cheeks, very subtly, because the fashion of the Regency era favoured a natural look, which meant the artifice had to be invisible, which meant it required even more skill and more time than an obviously painted face would have. The hair was dressed, teased, pinned, and if necessary supplemented with pieces or curls prepared the night before. Eyebrows were darkened with a mixture of soot and animal fat. Lips moistened with a preparation that might contain beeswax, rose oil, or a very faint tint of cochineal, the red dye derived from crushed insects. The whole process could take 30 to 60 minutes. And when it was complete, the woman looked in the mirror and saw, if the preparation had been successful, not herself, but the version of herself that the world was willing to accept. I want you to think about what that must have felt like. Not the vanity of it, the loneliness of it, the quiet, daily negotiation between who you actually were and who you needed to appear to be. The woman at the dressing table was not preening. She was preparing for battle, and the battlefield was every drawing room, every dinner party, every morning call where her face would be examined and assessed and silently compared to the faces of women 10 years younger. That daily ritual, performed thousands of times over the course of a lifetime, was not a luxury. It was labour. And like all labour performed by women in this era, it was invisible, uncompensated, and absolutely expected. There is another dimension to the Regency beauty industry that deserves mention, because it reveals the sophistication of the market even at this relatively early stage in the history of commercial beauty culture. That dimension is advertising, and specifically, the use of celebrity endorsement. The most successful beauty products of the Regency era were not simply sold on the basis of their ingredients or their promises. They were sold on the basis of association. The implication, sometimes stated, sometimes merely hinted at, that women of fashion, women of title, women whose youth and beauty were publicly admired, were using this very preparation. The endorsement was rarely explicit. A product might describe itself as used by persons of the first quality, or patronized by the nobility, or recommended by the most distinguished families. The language was deliberately vague, because specificity would have invited denial, and because vagueness allowed every woman who read the advertisement to imagine that the product was being used by whichever beautiful, youthful aristocrat she most admired. The psychology was identical to the celebrity endorsement of today. The implicit promise that by using this product you could become, or at least appear to become, more like the person you wish to be. And I find that continuity across 2 centuries genuinely striking. The Regency woman reading an advertisement for Gowland's lotion in the Morning Post was, in every psychologically meaningful sense, doing the same thing as a modern woman scrolling through sponsored content on her phone. The products have changed, the technology has changed, the fundamental transaction, the exchange of money for hope, has not changed at all. Here is something I keep returning to when I think about all of this. The Regency beauty industry was not an aberration. It was not a peculiar historical curiosity, a quaint reminder of how far we've come. It was the beginning of something, the beginning of an industry that learned, very early, that the most profitable emotion in the world is a woman's fear of becoming invisible. That industry is still with us. It's grown. It's become more sophisticated, more scientific, more regulated, more expensive. But at its core, the proposition is unchanged. You are aging. Aging is loss. We can sell you something that might slow the loss. And the fear that makes that proposition irresistible, the fear that a woman who shows her age has somehow failed, that fear was not invented by the beauty industry. It was inherited. From drawing rooms exactly like the ones we've been visiting tonight. But the fear of aging in Regency England was not only about faces and fortunes and social standing. There was another dimension, one that was rarely discussed openly, veiled in euphemism and silence, that women experienced in their bodies every day and had almost no language to describe. The physical reality of aging without modern medicine. What happened to a woman's body at 30, at 40, at 50, in an era when the doctors who treated her understood less about how her body worked than a first-year medical student knows today? That's the part of this story I think we need to sit with most carefully, because it's the part that has been most thoroughly erased from the romantic image of this era, and it's waiting for us just ahead. I want to be careful about how I approach this section, because the bodies we're about to discuss belong to real women, and the suffering they experienced deserves to be described with honesty, but also with a respect for the dignity they maintained in the face of it. The Regency era did not talk openly about women's bodies. The silence around female health was profound, systemic, and genuinely harmful. And I think we owe it to these women to talk about what they could not. Let's start with the single most defining physical experience of most Regency women's lives, and the one that had the most profound impact on how they aged. Childbirth. The average gentlewoman of this period married in her late teens or early 20s and bore children at intervals of roughly 18 months to 2 years throughout her fertile years. 6, 8, 10 pregnancies were not unusual. 12 or more were not unheard of. Each pregnancy placed enormous demands on the body. Each delivery carried real risk. And the cumulative effect of multiple pregnancies on a woman's physical health was something the Regency era observed, but could not fully understand. Modern obstetric science has given us a detailed understanding of what repeated childbirth does to the body. The pelvic floor muscles, which support the bladder, the uterus, and the bowel, are stretched and sometimes torn during delivery. With each subsequent delivery, the damage compounds. The condition known as pelvic organ prolapse, in which weakened muscles allow one or more pelvic organs to descend from their normal position, was extraordinarily common among women who had borne multiple children, and it produced symptoms that were, to put it plainly, miserable. Chronic discomfort, difficulty walking, urinary incontinence, a constant wearing awareness that something inside the body had shifted and could not be shifted back. In the Regency era, there was no treatment for this, no physical therapy, no surgical repair, barely any acknowledgement that the condition existed, because the conventions of the period made it nearly impossible for a woman to discuss her pelvic health with anyone, including her own doctor. The physician, who was almost invariably male, examined his female patients through a sheet, by touch rather than by sight, guided by modesty rules that prioritized decorum over accuracy. A woman experiencing pelvic floor dysfunction after her 8th delivery was expected to endure it in silence. Because the alternative, a frank discussion of what was happening below the waist, was socially unthinkable, I find that silence almost more distressing than the condition itself. The physical suffering was real, but it was made immeasurably worse by the impossibility of naming it, of talking about it, of having anyone acknowledge that it was happening and that it mattered. The Regency woman who could not walk comfortably to the end of her garden without discomfort was not just dealing with a medical problem. She was dealing with a medical problem that her culture had decided did not exist. Now let me talk about something that every single person in the Regency era experienced as they aged, but that affected women with a particular cruelty, given the visual scrutiny they were subjected to: the loss of teeth. We touched on this earlier in the context of beauty, but I want to come back to it now from a purely physical perspective, because the experience of losing your teeth, which for a modern reader might sound like a distant abstract concern, was for a Regency woman a sort of daily grinding misery. By 40, a significant proportion of Regency women had lost enough teeth to affect their appearance noticeably. By 50, many had lost most or all of their natural teeth. The dentures available were crude, uncomfortable, and unreliable. They didn't fit well. They slipped. They made eating difficult and speaking imprecise. Many women chose not to wear them, preferring the sunken-cheeked appearance of a toothless mouth to the constant irritation and social anxiety of dentures that might shift or fall at any moment. The impact on nutrition was significant. A woman who couldn't chew effectively was limited to soft foods, soups, porridges, breads soaked in liquid. The variety and quality of her diet declined at precisely the moment when her aging body needed more nutritional support, not less. The irony is bitter. The teeth that sugar destroyed were the teeth that had allowed her to eat the foods that might have kept her healthier for longer. Eyesight. This is another area where the Regency woman's experience of aging was dramatically different from our own, and where the absence of modern medicine created a kind of suffering that's genuinely difficult to imagine from the safety of a world with opticians on every high street. Presbyopia, the gradual loss of the eye's ability to focus on close objects, typically begins in the early 40s. It's a universal feature of human aging, as predictable as grey hair. In the modern world, we address it with reading glasses, progressive lenses, contact lenses, laser surgery. In Regency England, spectacles existed, but they were crude, limited in range, and carried a social stigma that made many women reluctant to wear them. Spectacles were associated with age, with infirmity, with scholarly pursuits that were considered unfeminine. A young woman wearing spectacles was perceived as bookish at best, unattractive at worst. An older woman wearing spectacles was simply confirming what everyone already suspected, that she was old. Many women refused to wear spectacles in company, squinting through social engagements, holding books at arm's length, pretending not to notice that the faces across the dinner table had become blurred. The vanity of this is obvious, but the compassion it deserves is equally obvious. In a world where a woman's appearance was her currency, wearing spectacles was the equivalent of publicly posting your declining bank balance. The refusal to wear them was not mere pride, it was self-preservation, joint pain, chronic back pain, the gradual stiffening of hands and fingers that made needlework painful and eventually impossible, the rheumatic conditions that afflicted women who had spent decades in poorly heated houses, walking on stone floors, sleeping in beds that were damp for months of the year. The Regency era had no anti-inflammatory medications, no joint replacement surgery, no physical therapy in any modern sense. The treatments available were limited to laudanum, a tincture of opium that dulled the pain but created its own devastating problems, and various poultices and liniments whose effectiveness ranged from minimal to non-existent. Laudanum deserves its own moment in this story, because it was both the Regency woman's greatest source of relief and one of her greatest dangers. It was cheap, readily available without prescription, and effective in the short term at addressing the chronic pain that so many older women experienced. But opium is addictive, and the Regency era had no understanding of addiction as a medical condition. A woman who began taking laudanum for back pain or joint pain could find herself dependent on it within weeks. The dependency was not recognized as such. It was attributed to moral weakness, to nervous temperament, to the vague but all-purpose diagnosis of female delicacy, and the treatment for it, when treatment was attempted at all, was typically more laudanum. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who struggled with opium addiction for most of his adult life, described the experience of dependency in terms that any modern addiction specialist would recognize. But his was a famous case, a literary case, one that history has treated with a certain romantic sympathy. The thousands of anonymous Regency women who fell into the same dependency, who took their drops in the privacy of their bedrooms, who hid their need from their families, who experienced the slow erosion of their cognitive function and their emotional stability without anyone naming what was happening to them. Those women have no literary monument. They have only the silence of a culture that didn't know how to see what it was looking at. And then there is the subject that the Regency era found most difficult of all, wrapped in more euphemism, more silence, more deliberate avoidance than perhaps any other aspect of women's physical experience, the change of life. What we now call menopause. The medical understanding of menopause in the early 19th century was, to be generous, rudimentary. The basic facts were understood. Women of a certain age ceased to menstruate, and this was associated with the end of their reproductive capacity. But the physiological mechanisms behind it, the hormonal changes, the cascade of symptoms that can accompany the transition, completely unknown. Estrogen would not be identified for another century. Hormonal replacement therapy was unimaginable. What Regency physicians offered instead was a collection of theories that range from the plausible to the genuinely bizarre. Some believed that the cessation of menstruation caused a dangerous build-up of blood that needed to be relieved through bleeding, performed using lancets or leeches. Others believed the symptoms, the hot flushes, the mood disturbances, the insomnia, the fatigue, were products of a hysterical temperament and could be addressed through rest, solitude, and the avoidance of excitement. Still others attributed the symptoms to moral or spiritual causes, suggesting that a woman who had lived correctly, who had fulfilled her duties as wife and mother, who had maintained her piety and her composure, would pass through the change with minimal difficulty, and that significant symptoms were therefore evidence of some failing in her character. I want you to let that settle for a moment, because the cruelty of that last theory is breathtaking in its completeness. A woman experiencing the physical symptoms of a biological process entirely beyond her control was told in effect that her symptoms were her fault, that if she had been a better person, a better wife, a better Christian, she would not be suffering. The physical pain was real. The medical profession's response was to add shame to it, and the woman who lay awake at 3 a.m, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, her body doing things she couldn't understand or explain, had no one to tell her that what she was experiencing was normal, that it would pass, that it was not a punishment, that she had done nothing wrong. That silence is what stays with me most when I think about this era. Not the dramatic cruelties, not the lead paint and the Waterloo teeth and the entailed estates. Those make for vivid stories, and they're important. But the silence around a woman's own body, the impossibility of saying I am in pain and having anyone take it seriously, the isolation of experiencing something that half the population experiences and being told that it's either imaginary or deserved, that is the quiet foundation on which all the louder injustices were built. And there is one more thing I want to explore before we move to the final movements of tonight's story, because I think it's the invisible architecture that held everything else in place, the culture, not the individual cruelties, but the system of beliefs, the shared assumptions, the published advice, the preached sermons, the instructional manuals that told women explicitly and repeatedly what they were supposed to be, when they were supposed to be it, and what they were supposed to do when the time for being it had passed. Because the fear of aging was not just something women felt, it was something they were taught, deliberately, systematically, from childhood, in every medium available to a literate society. The Conduct Manual was one of the most popular genres of Regency publishing. These were books, published in enormous quantities, purchased by families across the social spectrum, that provided detailed instructions on how women should behave at every stage of their lives. The titles tell you everything you need to know about their perspective. Sermons to young women, letters to a young lady, the female instructor, the lady's preceptor. These books were written overwhelmingly by men, though some were authored by women who'd internalized the system's values so thoroughly that the distinction was functionally irrelevant. And they shared a set of assumptions so consistent, so unvarying, that they read less like individual opinions and more like the operating manual for a machine. The assumptions were these: a woman's primary purpose was marriage, her primary asset was her youth and beauty, her primary responsibility was to deploy that asset wisely, and her primary challenge, once that purpose was fulfilled, was to age gracefully, which meant, in the vocabulary of the conduct manuals, to age invisibly, to withdraw from the centre of social life without complaint, to cede the stage to younger women without resentment, to accept diminishment as though it were a promotion, to rebrand decline as dignity, to dress the cage in flowers and call it a garden. The Reverend James Fordyce's Sermons to Young Women, first published in 1766 and reprinted continuously into the Regency period, is perhaps the most revealing example of this genre. Fordyce wrote with considerable eloquence about the beauty of young women. He praised the bloom of youth, the glow of health, the modesty of bearing that he considered the essential marks of feminine virtue. And then, with the calm of a man who has never had to live inside the system he's describing, he explained what happened when the bloom faded. The woman who aged, he wrote, should find her consolation in religion, in domestic duty, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had served her purpose. The spotlight that had illuminated her youth would move on, and she should let it go. Because to reach for it, to try to hold it, to refuse to accept that her season had passed, was not just futile, it was unseemly. Unseemly. I want you to hold that word, because it carries an enormous amount of weight in the Regency vocabulary. To be unseemly was not to be wrong the way stealing is wrong, or lying is wrong. It was to be wrong the way a wrong note is wrong, a disruption of harmony, an offence against the aesthetic order of things. An older woman who tried to remain visible, who dressed too brightly, who danced too enthusiastically, who laughed too loudly, who expressed opinions too forcefully, was not committing a sin. She was committing something that Regency society found almost more distressing than a sin. She was being inappropriate. She was violating the unwritten rules about what kind of space an older woman was allowed to occupy. And the punishment for that violation was not legal or physical. It was social. The raised eyebrow, the exchanged glance, the whispered comment, the slow withdrawal of invitation and inclusion that could reduce a woman's social world to the dimensions of a closet without anyone having to say a single unkind word to her face. The Church reinforced this message with remarkable consistency. Sunday sermons regularly addressed the theme of worldly vanity, and the language they used made it clear that the vanity in question was primarily female. The woman who clung to youth, who painted her face, who dressed above her age, was not just making a fashion mistake. She was displaying spiritual immaturity, a failure to accept God's plan for her life, which apparently included becoming invisible at 45. The theological reasoning was circular but effective. God had made women beautiful in their youth, so that they could attract husbands and bear children. When the beauty faded, it was a sign that God's purpose for them had been fulfilled, and to resist that fulfillment was to resist God himself. The legal system provided the material foundation for all of this. We've already discussed coverture, the legal framework under which a married woman had no independent legal identity. But there is one aspect of the law that deserves particular attention in the context of aging, because it reveals how thoroughly the system was designed to make older women dependent and therefore invisible. The law of dower, which had provided some protection for widows in earlier centuries, was gradually being replaced during the Regency period by the system of jointures we discussed earlier. The effect of this change was to shift the financial protection of older women from a legal right, something the law guaranteed, to a contractual provision, something that had to be negotiated before the marriage. The implications of this shift were significant. A legal right exists regardless of the party's negotiating skill. A contractual provision exists only if someone fought for it. And the person supposed to fight for the bride's future financial security was, in most cases, her father, negotiating with the groom's family at a time when the bride was 17 years old. And the question of what her life would look like at 50 was, to put it charitably, not at the top of anyone's priority list. The terms were often set when the bride was too young to understand them and too powerless to influence them. And those terms, negotiated in the optimism of youth, would determine the material conditions of her old age, decades later, when the world that had celebrated her debut had long since moved on. What strikes me most about all of this, the conduct manuals, the sermons, the legal architecture, the medical theories, is not any individual piece of it, but the totality, the completeness of the enclosure. There was no gap in the wall, no space in the system for an alternative narrative about what it meant to be an older woman, no voice saying, actually, your best years might be ahead of you, no institution offering a different path, no story, no sermon, no law, no medical theory that suggested a woman past 40 might have something valuable to offer the world that was not related to her appearance, her fertility, or her willingness to get out of the way. The fear of aging in Regency England was not just a feeling, it was an environment, and the women who lived inside that environment breathed it in every day, from every direction, from the books they read to the sermons they heard to the laws that governed their property to the doctors who treated their bodies. The fear was not irrational. It was the only rational response to a world that had been constructed with considerable care and consistency to make aging the worst thing that could happen to a woman. And it brings us to something that I think is both the saddest and the most important part of this story, the erasure. Because the fear of aging in Regency England was not just a fear of wrinkles or poverty or social demotion. At its deepest level, it was a fear of disappearance, a fear that the world would simply stop seeing you, stop hearing you, stop remembering that you were there. And the terrifying thing, the thing that made the fear so rational, was that the world did exactly that. The older woman in Regency England did not just feel invisible. She was, in the most literal and measurable ways, made invisible, erased from the cultural record, from the visual imagination, from the stories her own era told about itself, how that erasure worked, how systematic it was, and what it cost the women who lived inside it, is where we're going next. And I want you to listen closely, because I think you'll recognize something in it that feels uncomfortably familiar. Let's start with the most visible form of erasure, the one you can literally see if you know where to look. Portraiture. The painted portrait was, in Regency England, the primary means by which a person's image was recorded and preserved. Photography didn't yet exist. If you wanted to be seen by future generations, you sat for a portrait. and the portraits that survive from this era tell a very specific story about who was considered worth seeing. Young women were painted constantly. The Regency portrait tradition is overwhelmingly populated by women in their teens and 20s, fresh-faced, smooth-skinned, dressed in the high-waisted muslin gowns and delicate accessories of the period. Their portraits were commissioned by fathers as records of a daughter's beauty at her peak, by husbands as celebrations of a new wife's youth, by families as assets to be displayed in drawing rooms and galleries, and not incidentally as advertisements of a family's ability to produce attractive marriageable daughters. The portrait of a young woman was a social document as much as an artistic one. It said, "Look at what we have to offer." Older women were painted much less frequently, and when they were painted, the terms of the portraiture shifted in ways that are revealing. The young woman's portrait emphasized beauty, skin, light in the eyes, the softness of the mouth, the arrangement of the hair. The older woman's portrait was, when it existed at all, emphasized character, dignity, composure. The vocabulary of the portrait had changed because the vocabulary of value had changed. The young woman was worth painting because she was beautiful. The older woman, if she was painted at all, was worth painting because she was important. A matriarch, a benefactress, a woman of rank whose position demanded a record. But importance was a much narrower qualification than beauty, and far fewer women possessed it. The result is a visual record dramatically skewed toward youth. If you walk through a gallery of Regency portraits, the faces that look back at you are overwhelmingly young. The older women, the mothers, the aunts, the grandmothers, the widows, are largely absent. They existed. They were there. They occupied the same houses and attended the same events and managed the same households as the young women whose faces fill the frames. But they were not recorded. And because they were not recorded, they were, in the most literal sense, not seen. Not by their contemporaries who chose not to commission their portraits, and not by us who have inherited a visual archive that tells us, falsely, that Regency England was a world populated entirely by the young. The fashion plates tell a similar story, and in some ways an even more pointed one. Fashion plates were the magazines of the Regency era, illustrated pages that depicted the latest styles in women's clothing and accessories. Enormously popular, widely circulated, consulted by women across the social spectrum as guides to what was fashionable. And the women depicted in these plates were, without exception, young, not merely young in appearance, idealized in youth. The fashion plate woman had no lines on her face, no grey in her hair, the impossibly smooth skin and impossibly slender figure of a 17-year-old, regardless of whether the dress she was modelling was appropriate for a woman of 17 or a woman of 45. The message was not subtle. Fashion, the language of visual self-presentation that Regency women used to communicate their status, their taste, and their position in the social order, was a language that had no words for aging. The older woman who wanted to dress well, who wanted to participate in the visual culture of her era, who wanted to walk into a room and feel that her appearance communicated something intentional and dignified, had to navigate a fashion system that simply did not acknowledge her existence. The plates showed her nothing. The dressmakers catered to her reluctantly. The fashion vocabulary of the period, with its emphasis on lightness, delicacy, transparency, and the deliberate exposure of arms and décolletage, was a vocabulary designed for young bodies, and hostile to older ones. There is a moment in the letters of Lady Sarah Spencer, written in the early 1800s, that captures this perfectly. She describes attending a ball at which an older woman, a woman she clearly respected and perhaps even admired, appeared in a gown that would have been fashionable on a woman of 20. But on a woman of her years, Lady Sarah writes, it looked rather unfortunately chosen. The tone is not cruel. It is sympathetic, but the judgment is clear. The older woman had attempted to speak the visual language of her era, and the era had responded by finding her attempt pathetic, not because the dress was ugly, not because the woman was ugly, but because the dress was designed for youth, and the woman was no longer young, and the gap between the two was visible and, in the eyes of the drawing room, faintly embarrassing. I find that quietly devastating. Not the judgment itself, but the impossibility of the position. If the older woman dressed in the fashion of her era, she looked foolish. If she dressed conservatively, she looked old. If she withdrew from fashion entirely, she disappeared. There was no right answer. There was only a series of wrong ones, each carrying its own particular flavour of humiliation. Now let me talk about the erasure that I think matters most, because it shaped not just how older women were seen in their own time, but how they have been remembered, or not remembered, ever since. The literary erasure, the stories, the novels, the plays, the poems, the entire imaginative output of the Regency era, one of the most productive and most brilliant literary periods in English history, which had almost nothing to say about women over the age of 30. Think about the novels of Jane Austen, the writer who defined the Regency era in the popular imagination, who remains, 2 centuries later, the lens through which most of us first encounter this world. Her heroines are young. Elizabeth Bennet is 20. Eleanor Dashwood is 19. Catherine Morland is 17. Emma Woodhouse is 20. Anne Elliot, the oldest of Austen's heroines, is 27. And the entire premise of Persuasion is that she is almost too old for love, that her chance has very nearly passed, that she is, in the devastating phrase Austen puts in her own mouth, past the bloom of youth. 27. Let that land. The oldest heroine in the greatest novelist's greatest body of work is 27, and the novel treats this as a borderline case, a near miss, and almost too late. Now, Austen was far too intelligent a writer to do this by accident. She understood exactly what she was doing. Her novels are, among many other things, a sustained examination of the marriage market and the pressures it placed on young women. She wrote about youth, because youth was where the drama was, where the stakes were highest, where the decisions that would shape a woman's entire future were made in the space of a single season. The older women in her novels exist, but they exist at the margins. Mrs. Bennet is a figure of comedy. Her anxieties about her daughter's marriages played for laughs, even though the anxieties themselves are perfectly rational. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a figure of authority and absurdity, powerful but ridiculous. Miss Bates in Emma is perhaps Austen's most honest portrait of an older unmarried woman, and she is, significantly, the character whom Emma herself is most afraid of becoming. When Mr. Knightley rebukes Emma for being cruel to Miss Bates at Box Hill, the sting of the rebuke is not just that Emma has been unkind, it's that Emma has been unkind to a woman who represents what Emma herself might become if fortune turns against her. Miss Bates is the ghost of Christmas future, and she talks too much, and she is poor, and she is kind, and nobody particularly wants to listen to her. Austen wrote about these women with compassion, with clarity, with the particular precision that is her greatest gift. But she did not make them heroines. She couldn't. The genre wouldn't allow it. The marriage plot, the dominant narrative structure of the English novel in this period, required a young heroine, a courtship, an obstacle, a resolution. An older woman had already passed through the machinery of the marriage plot. She had either been processed successfully, in which case her story was over, or she had been rejected by the machinery, in which case she was, in narrative terms, a casualty. Either way, she was not a protagonist. She was furniture. And this is not just an Austen phenomenon. It's a structural feature of Regency literature as a whole. The novels of Maria Edgeworth, Frances Burney, Charlotte Smith, Sidney Owenson all follow the same pattern. Young heroines, courtship narratives, older women as supporting characters, obstacles or warnings. The literary imagination of the period had a very clear idea of which women were worth telling stories about, and that idea had an age limit. The effect of this literary erasure on the women who lived through it is something I think we underestimate. Stories matter. They tell us who counts. They tell us whose experiences are worth recording, whose feelings are worth exploring, whose interior lives are complex enough to sustain a narrative. When an entire literary tradition tells you that your story ended at 25, that the interesting part of your life is over, that the years ahead of you are an epilogue rather than a plot, the psychological effect is profound. You begin to believe it. You begin to see yourself the way the novels see you, as a finished product, a concluded narrative, a woman whose most significant chapters have already been written, and the loneliness of that, the loneliness of being alive and present and full of feeling in a world that has decided your feelings are no longer interesting enough to explore, is something I find almost impossible to think about without feeling a kind of grief. There is one more dimension to the erasure that I want to sit with, because it's the one that resonates most powerfully with our own time, the social erasure, the way that older women were gradually, almost imperceptibly, removed from the social spaces that had defined their lives. This didn't happen suddenly. There was no formal announcement, no rule posted on the wall of Almack's saying women over 40 were no longer welcome. It happened through 1,000 small adjustments, each one so minor that it barely registered individually, and so cumulative that their combined effect was devastating. The invitations became less frequent. The conversations at dinner parties turned to topics that assumed a younger perspective. The hostess who planned the seating arrangement placed the older woman at the end of the table, near the other older women, in a quiet cluster that was physically present at the gathering but socially peripheral to it. The young men who had once danced with her no longer asked. The young women who had once sought her advice no longer came. The drawing room, which had been the centre of her social existence for decades, gradually reconfigured itself around a younger generation, and she found herself sitting in the same chair she had always sat in the same room she had always occupied, watching the world she had helped to build move on without her. The Regency social commentator and letter writer Lady Bessborough described this experience in a passage that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. She wrote about attending a ball at which she realized, with a clarity she described as almost physical, that she was no longer being seen, not ignored, precisely. People spoke to her, people were polite, but the energy of the room, the attention, the interest, the subtle electrical current of social engagement she had navigated so skillfully for decades, had shifted. It was flowing toward the younger women, the new faces, the fresh arrivals, and she was standing in the current's wake, still present, still visible, but no longer relevant. I find that word, relevant, almost unbearably precise, not rejected, not excluded, simply no longer relevant. The social world had moved on, and she had not moved with it, not because she had failed to keep up, but because the world had decided that keeping up was no longer required of her. She'd been released from the obligation of relevance, and that release, which sounds almost like a kindness, was in practice a sentence. Can I ask you something? When you think about the women in your own life, the older women, your mother, your grandmother, an aunt, a colleague, a friend, have you ever noticed the moment when they stopped being seen? Not by you necessarily, by the world. The moment when conversations started happening around them rather than with them. When their opinions, which had once commanded attention, began to be received with a polite smile and a gentle change of subject. The moment when they became, in the vocabulary of Regency England, past their bloom. Because the erasure we've been tracing through the drawing rooms and fashion plates and novels of Regency England is not as distant as we'd like to believe. The technology has changed, the costumes have changed, the legal framework has changed, enormously and for the better. But the underlying architecture of the erasure, the quiet, systematic removal of older women from the cultural spaces that matter, from the stories we tell, from the images we consume, from the conversations that shape how we see the world, that architecture is still standing. It's been renovated, it's been modernized, it's been given a fresh coat of paint, but the foundation is the same one that Lady Bessborough stood on in that ballroom 2 centuries ago, wondering when exactly she had stopped mattering. And yet, there is another side to this story, a side that the Regency era tried very hard to suppress, and that historians have only recently begun to uncover and celebrate, because not every woman accepted the erasure. Not every woman went quietly into the smaller room, the darker dress, the peripheral chair. Some women pushed back, some women refused, some women discovered, to their own surprise, and to the considerable discomfort of the society around them, that getting old, for all its terrors and all its costs, came with something that nobody had bothered to mention, a kind of freedom, a reckless, exhilarating, entirely unauthorized freedom that the rules had never anticipated, and that polite society had absolutely no idea how to handle. Those women, the rebels, the eccentrics, the dowagers who seized power, and the spinsters who built empires of the mind, are where this story ends, and I think you're going to like them very much. Let me tell you about a woman named Hester Thrale Piozzi. You may not have heard of her, though in her own time she was one of the most famous women in England. She was a friend and confidant of Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer, the intellectual giant of the 18th century. She presided over one of the most celebrated literary salons in London. She was witty, sharp, well-read, and by all accounts a genuinely formidable personality. She married twice. Her first husband, Henry Thrale, was a wealthy brewer. They had 12 children, though only 4 survived to adulthood. When Thrale died in 1781, Hester was left a wealthy widow with considerable social standing, and the freedom, within the constraints of the mourning period, to do whatever she pleased. What she pleased was to marry Gabriel Piozzi, an Italian music teacher. She was 43. He was Catholic, foreign, and of significantly lower social standing. The reaction of polite society was volcanic. Her friends were appalled. Her own daughters publicly disowned her. Samuel Johnson, who had depended on her companionship and hospitality for years, wrote her a letter of such furious disappointment that it effectively ended their friendship. The scandal was enormous, not because Hester had done anything illegal or immoral, but because she had done something far worse in the eyes of Regency society. She had behaved as though her own desires mattered more than the expectations of her world. She had acted as though a woman of 43 still had the right to choose, still had the right to want, still had a story worth living. And here's the part I find genuinely magnificent. She married Piozzi, moved to Wales, and by all accounts was deeply happy. She wrote books, she travelled, she entertained, she lived to be 80, and she did so on her own terms, which were not the terms the world had offered her. The freedom she claimed was not given. It was taken, and the cost of taking it was high. The loss of friends, the loss of reputation, the loss of the social world that had sustained her for decades. But she paid the cost and kept moving. There is something in that I find genuinely inspiring. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard, and she did it anyway. Now Hester Piozzi had money. She had social capital, even if it was diminished. She had resources that most women of her era could not dream of. The freedom she seized was available to her partly because she could afford the consequences of seizing it. But she was not the only woman who refused to accept the terms the system offered. Let me tell you about another one, because her rebellion was even more dramatic, and its implications even more radical. Lady Hester Stanhope was the niece of William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. She grew up at the centre of political power, acting as Pitt's hostess and unofficial political advisor during the final years of his premiership. She was brilliant, imperious, sharp-tongued, and utterly uninterested in the conventional feminine role that Regency society had prepared for her. When Pitt died in 1806, she was left without a domestic role, without a husband, and without any obvious place in the social order. She was 30 years old. What she did next is one of the most extraordinary stories of the Regency period. She left England. She did not go to Paris or Rome, the standard destinations for English travellers of means. She went to the Middle East. She travelled through Egypt, through Syria, through the deserts of the Levant. She adopted male Turkish dress. She rode on horseback through territories that European women simply did not visit. She was received by the Bedouin as a queen. She established herself in a remote fortress on Mount Lebanon, where she lived for the remaining 23 years of her life, dispensing advice, receiving travellers and diplomats, and governing her small domain with an authority that no drawing-room in London would have permitted her. She was, by any conventional Regency standard, completely mad. She was also, by any honest assessment, completely alive. She had looked at the future that England offered her, the dwindling social world of the ageing spinster, the peripheral chair, the darker dress, and she had said no, not in a whisper, in a shout that carried across 3 continents and 2 decades. She chose the desert over the drawing-room, and the desert, with all its dangers and discomforts, gave her something that London never had: the right to be large, the right to take up space, the right to be the most important person in the room. Not because she was young or beautiful, but because she was formidable. And formidable, in a world that didn't know what to do with her, was enough. I find Hester Stanhope endlessly fascinating, partly because her story is so dramatic, and partly because the drama reveals by contrast how narrow the options were for the women who stayed behind. Stanhope could leave because she had no husband, no children, and just enough money to fund an unconventional life. Most women had none of those things. Most women couldn't flee to Mount Lebanon. They had to find their rebellion closer to home, in smaller spaces, with quieter tools. There is another woman I want to mention. Because her rebellion was not geographic, but artistic, and because it illuminates a dimension of the aging woman's experience that we haven't yet explored. Sarah Siddons, the greatest actress of the Regency era, arguably the greatest actress in the history of the English stage, performed some of her most celebrated roles in her 40s and 50s. Her Lady Macbeth, which she first performed at 30 and continued to perform for decades, was described by contemporaries as one of the most terrifying and magnificent achievements in the history of theatre. She aged on stage, in front of audiences who watched her face change year by year, and the aging did not diminish her power, it amplified it. The lines on her face, the depth of her voice, the gravity that years of living had given her, made her performances more compelling, not less. She became, in middle age, the living proof that a woman's power could increase as her youth faded, that the thing the system called decline could, in the right context, look very much like ascent. But Siddons was operating in a sphere, the theatre, that existed partially outside the normal social rules. The stage had its own economy of value, and that economy, while not free of age prejudice, was less ruthlessly organised around youth than the drawing room. Siddons could age on stage because the stage measured a different kind of beauty, the beauty of truth, of emotional power, of the ability to hold an audience in silence. The drawing room measured a different beauty entirely, and by its measurements, Siddons, like every other woman, was a depreciating asset. For poorer women, for women without Stanhope's independence or Siddons' genius or Piozzi's wealth, the rebellion took different forms, quieter forms, less dramatic, but no less real. And one of the most important of these quieter rebellions was friendship. The communities of older women who found each other, who sustained each other, who created private worlds of mutual support and intellectual companionship that existed beneath the radar of the official culture. The historian Amanda Vickery has documented these communities with beautiful specificity. Networks of older women who corresponded faithfully, who visited regularly, who shared books and ideas and practical advice. Women who had been marginalized by the marriage market but who refused to be marginalized by each other. They read together. They discussed politics and philosophy and religion. They supported each other through illness and financial hardship. They created, in the negative space left by the system's indifference, a kind of social life that was entirely their own, ungoverned by the rules of the marriage market, unreported in the fashion plates, invisible to the world of Olmax, and quietly, stubbornly, beautifully real. These communities rarely appear in the historical record, because they were not considered newsworthy. They produced no scandals, held no balls, attracted no gossip. They existed in the margins, in the letters and diaries never intended for publication, in the small domestic spaces where women gathered not to be seen, but to be known. And I think there's something profoundly moving about that. In the midst of a culture designed to erase them, older women found ways to make themselves visible to each other. The world might not see them, but they could see each other. And for some of them, for the lucky ones, that was enough. Let me tell you about the women who wrote, because writing was, for Regency women of a certain age, one of the very few acts of self-creation available to them. It required no capital, no connections, no permission. It required only a pen, paper, and the stubborn belief that your thoughts were worth recording, even if no one else agreed. The Regency era produced an extraordinary number of women writers who did their best work in middle age and beyond. We've already discussed Jane Austen, who published all 6 of her major novels between the ages of 35 and 41. But there were others, many others, whose names have been recovered by historians after generations of neglect. Maria Edgeworth published Castle Rackrent, one of the first historical novels in English, at the age of 32, and continued writing prolifically into her 60s. Her novels about Irish life were admired by Walter Scott, who credited her as a direct influence on his own work, a debt that literary history has not always remembered as clearly as it should. Frances Burney published her final novel, The Wanderer, at the age of 61. The book was not well received by critics. The literary establishment, which had once celebrated her as a prodigy, now dismissed her as past her prime. But the novel itself, which deals with a woman struggling for survival in a society that offers her no institutional support, is in many ways her most radical work, precisely because it was written from a perspective that only age could provide. She knew things at 61 that she'd not known at 25. The critics weren't interested in what those things were. She wrote them down anyway. Hannah More, the religious writer and social reformer, began her most influential work in her 40s and continued writing and campaigning into her 80s. She founded schools for the poor. She wrote tracts that were read by millions. She corresponded with politicians and bishops and prime ministers. And she did all of this as an unmarried woman, a spinster by the technical definition, who had transformed the limitations of her position into a platform for influence that many married women, bound by the demands of husband and children and household, could never have achieved. There is something in this pattern that I think is worth noticing. The women who rebelled most effectively against the system were often the women who had been most thoroughly excluded by it. The spinster who had no husband to consult, no children to supervise, no household to manage, had something that her married counterparts did not: time, unstructured, unaccounted for, entirely her own time. And some of these women, the brilliant ones, the stubborn ones, the ones who refused to believe their story was over, used that time to build something. Not a family, as the system prescribed, but a body of work, a network of influence, a legacy that would outlast any of the marriages that had been denied to them. Let me tell you about one more woman, because her story captures something that I think is the perfect ending for tonight. Her name was Mary Berry. She was born in 1763 and died in 1852 at the age of 88. She never married. She was, by every technical measure, exactly the kind of woman the Regency system was designed to pity and forget. A spinster. An aging woman without a husband, without children, without the institutional protections that marriage provided. And she was one of the most socially powerful women in London for over 50 years. She and her sister Agnes were inseparable companions. They travelled Europe together, attended the finest salons, corresponded with the most important intellectuals and politicians of their era, and maintained a social circle that included royalty. Mary wrote books, edited literary correspondence, hosted gatherings that attracted the leading minds of successive generations. She was a fixture of London intellectual life across the entire span of the Regency era and well beyond it. And she accomplished all of this without any of the institutional supports that the system said a woman needed in order to matter. Horace Walpole, the great letter writer and social observer, was so taken with the Berry sisters that he left Mary his manuscripts and papers, a literary inheritance that she edited and published after his death. She was trusted with the private thoughts of one of the 18th century's sharpest minds. Not because she was young, not because she was beautiful, not because she was married to someone important, but because she was intelligent, because she was reliable, because she had earned his respect through decades of friendship. Mary Berry was not a rebel in the dramatic sense. She did not scandalize society or defy convention in any overt way. Her rebellion was quieter, and in some ways more powerful. She simply refused to become invisible. She refused to accept the diminished role that the system had prepared for her. She continued to show up, to think, to write, to engage, to matter. Year after year, decade after decade, long past the point at which the world had expected her to withdraw. And the world, confronted with a woman who simply would not disappear, eventually adjusted. It made room for her. Reluctantly, perhaps. Imperfectly, certainly. But it made room. I find that deeply moving. Not because Mary Berry defeated the system. She didn't. The system continued to grind forward, chewing up women's youth and spitting out their old age with the same mechanical indifference it had always shown. But she found a way to live inside the system without being destroyed by it. She carved out a space for herself that the rules had not anticipated and that no one had given her permission to occupy. And she occupied it for 88 years. I want to come back now, as we begin to let this story settle, to the woman we met at the beginning of tonight's journey. The 23-year-old in the London drawing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror, feeling the first quiet tightening of a fear she would carry for the rest of her life. What would you tell her if you could? What would you say to a woman standing at the threshold of a system that had already decided what she was worth and was in the process of counting down? I think I would tell her that the fear was real. I would not pretend otherwise, because pretending that the system was fair or kind or survivable without cost would be a lie, and she deserved better than a lie. The system was not fair. It was brutal in its mathematics and relentless in its enforcement, and the women who fell through its cracks suffered in ways that history has only recently begun to acknowledge. But I would also tell her that the fear was not the whole story. I would tell her about Hester Piozzi, who married the man she loved at 43 and did not apologize, about Frances Burney, who wrote her most radical novel at 61 and did not care that the critics had moved on, about Hannah More, who built a legacy in a world that had told her she was not allowed to have one, about Mary Berry, who simply refused to disappear and kept showing up until the world made room, about Hester Stanhope, who walked away from every rule England had ever written for her and built a kingdom on a mountain, because the drawing rooms were too small for the person she intended to become. I would tell her that getting old is a loss. That is true. The system took things from women that they deserved to keep, and the taking was not gentle. But getting old, for the women who survived it with their minds intact and their spirits unbroken, also brought something the system had not anticipated. A kind of clarity, a kind of freedom, the freedom that comes when the rules stop applying to you, when the drawing room stops watching, when the mirror stops mattering, and you are left at last with only yourself. And some women, the remarkable ones, discovered that themselves were enough, more than enough, that the person who remained after the beauty and the youth and the social currency had all been spent was stronger, sharper, more interesting, and more alive than the person the system had wanted them to be at 17. I think about that discovery sometimes, the discovery that the rules were wrong about you, and I wonder how many women made it. Not the famous ones, not the Burneys and the Moores and the Berrys and the Stanhopes, the ordinary ones, the women whose names were never recorded, whose diaries were never published, whose stories were never told. The woman who sat by the window of a small rented room in Bath and read a novel, and found herself thinking thoughts that no one would ever know she had thought. The woman who walked in a garden in late October and noticed for the first time in years the colour of the light through the leaves, and felt something inside her that she couldn't name, but that felt against all evidence and all expectation, like peace. The woman who looked in the mirror at 50 and saw not the ruin the world had promised her, but a face that was, in its own unfashionable way, interesting, lived in, full of stories, full of survival. I think about these women a lot, not as historical figures, not as subjects in an academic study, but as people, real people who woke up in the morning with their specific set of worries and their specific set of small joys, who had opinions about things, who found certain people funny and certain people tiresome, who preferred one kind of cake to another, who had a favourite chair, who sometimes, in the right light, on the right afternoon, felt perfectly and completely themselves, and who lived in a world that had decided somewhere above their heads and without consulting them that those selves were only interesting up to a point. That point being, roughly, the moment the bloom began to fade. There's a particular kind of cruelty in being rendered invisible, not through hatred, but through indifference. Hatred at least acknowledges you. It requires attention. It requires someone to look at you directly and decide they don't like what they see. Indifference is different. Indifference is the society reorganizing itself around younger women without ever once looking back to check who got left behind. It is the drawing room conversation that moves past you without noticing. The dinner party seating arrangement that places you at the quiet end. The fashion system that produces nothing you can wear. The novel tradition that produces no heroine you can recognize. It is erasure by committee, by consensus, by collective forgetting. And yet, there is something in the human spirit, I genuinely believe this, that refuses to be entirely erased. That finds ways of persisting, of being real, of mattering to someone, even when the official culture has stopped counting it. The ordinary Regency woman who never wrote a novel and never rode through the Syrian desert and never scandalized society with a late second marriage, she still had a life that was hers, completely, irreducibly hers. She had conversations that mattered to the people she had them with. She had knowledge accumulated over decades about people, about households, about the quiet architecture of daily human life that no debutante of 17 could have replicated. She had a depth of feeling that the marriage market had never bothered to measure because the marriage market didn't have the right instruments. And she had time. At 50, at 60, the relentless social performance of youth was finally over. No more seasons to survive. No more drawing rooms to navigate with the careful attention of someone who knows they're being watched. No more mirrors to consult with that particular combination of hope and dread. Just the morning, and the light coming through the window, and whatever she chose to do with the hours that were, at last, entirely her own. For some women, I think, that freedom arrived like grief. The loss of the role, the loss of the audience, the loss of the sense of purpose that the system had constructed for them. Even a system built on impossible expectations can become, over time, a kind of structure. And losing structure, even bad structure, is disorienting. But for others, for the women who had always suspected somewhere in the private interior of themselves that the system's assessment of their value was simply wrong, that freedom arrived like exhaling after a very long time of holding your breath, the quiet of it, the space of it, the strange, unexpected gift of no longer having to be what you were told to be. I find I return to those women again and again, the unnamed ones, the unrecorded ones, because I think their experience of aging, the part that comes after the terror, after the loss, after the adjustment, contains something that the famous rebels and the celebrated writers couldn't quite capture, something that requires ordinariness to be fully seen, the discovery, made in private without an audience, that you are still here, still thinking, still feeling, still, against every expectation the world had placed on you, interesting. Not to the marriage market, not to the conduct manual, not to the fashion plate or the portrait commission or the season's social mathematics, but to yourself. And maybe, if you were lucky, if you had a sister or a friend or a neighbour who had made the same quiet discovery in a room not so different from yours, to someone else too. Those women existed. They had to have existed. Because the alternative, the idea that every woman who aged in Regency England was simply crushed by the system's weight, is simply not credible. Human beings are more resilient than any system designed to contain them. They find cracks in the walls, they grow in directions that nobody anticipated, they survive. And in surviving they prove something that no conduct manual or sermon or jointure calculation can account for. That the human spirit is not a depreciating asset. That some things about a person actually appreciate with time, patience, wisdom, the capacity for stillness, the ability to see through the surface of things to the structure underneath. These are not the qualities the Regency marriage market valued, but they are the qualities that make a life worth living after the market has closed. That is not a comfortable truth. It does not erase the suffering. It does not justify the system. But it is a truth that I think deserves to be spoken tonight, in the quiet, in the dark, wherever you are listening. And it brings me to one last thing I want to say, not about the Regency era, but about us, about the world we live in now. Because I do not want to leave you with the impression that this story belongs entirely to the past. The details have changed, the laws have changed, the opportunities available to women have expanded enormously, and the progress is real and should be celebrated. But the fear, the quiet, atmospheric, almost subconscious fear that a woman's value diminishes as she ages, that her best years are behind her by 40, that the world will stop seeing her once she stops being young. That fear has not disappeared. It has migrated. It has changed its clothes and updated its vocabulary. It no longer speaks the language of jointures and entailments. It speaks the language of algorithms and engagement metrics, and the particular cruelty of a culture that worships youth with a fervour that would have made the lady patronesses of Almack's blush. I do not say this to diminish the progress. The progress is real. A woman today has legal rights, financial independence, professional opportunities, and personal freedoms that a Regency woman could not have imagined. But the architecture of the erasure, the quiet mechanism by which older women are gradually removed from the cultural spaces that matter, is still operating. It has been modernized. It has been given better technology. But the foundation is the same one that Lady Bessborough stood on in that ballroom, and I think we owe it to her, and to every woman who came after her, to notice it, to name it, and to refuse to accept it as inevitable. The room is getting softer now. The candles in that Regency drawing room have burned down to their last inch. The woman at the mirror has turned away. She doesn't know yet what her life will be. She doesn't know if she will marry or if she will not. She doesn't know if the fear will consume her, or if she will find, somewhere in the years ahead, a way to outgrow it. She knows only that the clock is ticking, that the mirror is not kind, and that the world outside her window is not built for women who age. But she is still here. She's still standing in that room, She's still alive and complicated and full of thoughts that no one has asked her to share. And 200 years from now, in a world she could not possibly imagine, someone will be lying in the dark listening to her story, thinking about her, seeing her, remembering that she was there. And maybe that is enough. Maybe being remembered, even late, even imperfectly, even by strangers who will never know your name, is a kind of victory that the system never accounted for. A small, quiet, final rebellion against the erasure. A candle that burns longer than anyone expected, in a room that was supposed to go dark a long time ago. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening all the way through to the end, or for drifting off somewhere along the way, which is perfectly fine and exactly what this was designed for. If this story meant something to you, I would love it if you left a like or a comment or just came back next time. And if you're lying in the dark right now, with the world getting softer and quieter and more distant with every breath, then let it. Let the Regency fade. Let the drawing room go dim. Let the mirror turn away. You don't need it tonight. You don't need anyone to tell you what you're worth tonight. You already know. You've always known. The system just made it hard to hear. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time, friend.